Welcome to Japan True Stories. Tonight, a quiet story from Japan. Settle in. From a Japan that no longer exists. These accounts have passed quietly from one person to the next across decades, and they find you now. Breathe and stay. In the summer her mother died, Mio finally went to sort through the old storehouse at the back of the family property, a low wood-roofed building set at the edge of the garden in the hills outside Nagano. Locked for as long as anyone living could remember, the key kept on a length of cotton cord looped over the kitchen door frame above the salt jar. She had the key warm in her pocket from the walk down through the garden, through the long grass and the late summer heat, and she pressed it into the lock and turned, and the door opened slowly inward, swelling in its frame the way old wood does in a humid August. The smell that came to meet her was the smell of a very long time. Cedar, something sweetly medicinal, and beneath it all the particular fine scent of paper that has been sitting undisturbed in the dark for longer than she could measure. She stepped inside, and the light from the open door followed her in as a single slow beam, catching the dust she had raised with her first step, small motes, unhurried, rising and drifting and rising again, as though they had all the patience in the world. Pause. She stood still and let her eyes settle, and she was aware with a kind of gentle weight of how much was in here. Shelf after shelf of boxes and bundles and wrapped things, the accumulated quiet of many generations, each one having left something behind without ceremony, the way families do. Along the walls the shelves ran low and deep, and on them were lacquered boxes with their paint worn thin at the corners, bundles of cloth folded and tied with cord that had gone brittle with age, a ceramic flask with a hairline crack running its full length, a stack of wooden trays nested carefully inside each other, and here and there, incongruously, things from more recent centuries. A small cardboard box, a folded cloth bag from a department store that had long since closed. Mio had brought a notebook and a pen and the general intention of cataloging, of beginning at least the work of understanding what was here. It had been her mother's project, endlessly deferred, and now it was hers. The way unfinished things become ours when the person who meant to finish them is gone. She started on the left-hand shelf, the nearest one, where the light from the door was strongest, and she worked slowly, lifting each box, each bundle, noting briefly what it seemed to contain. A tea bowl wrapped in silk, she wrote, green and brown glaze, possibly Meiji era, a pair of small lacquered trays, some surface damage, a round box, contents unclear, very light. And the work had the quality of something that could not be hurried without becoming careless. And so she did not hurry. Breath. The morning moved in this way, quiet and methodical, the kind of work that empties the mind of everything except the small present task. This box, then this one, then this cloth bundle whose cord had gone too brittle to untie. And so she simply noted it and set it back exactly as she had found it, without disturbing anything more than necessary. After perhaps 2 hours, she moved past the first shelving unit, stepping deeper into the storehouse, past the point where the light from the open door still clearly reached, as she took out her phone and switched on the small torch, and the beam swept across the back walls and made the dust motes scatter and resettle, patient as always. Pause. The back shelves were older. She could feel it in some way. She could not have named precisely a difference in the weight of the air, a stillness that seemed to have been accumulating for a very long time, and the things on them were less identifiable. The lacquer darker and more worn, the cloth bundles more completely surrendered to time. The ink on what labels remained reduced to ghost marks that her torch beam could barely find. She moved carefully, not wanting to disturb anything. And she was aware, as she often was in spaces like this, of the particular strangeness of being the only living thing in a room full of objects that had all been touched by people now gone. People whose names she did not know and whose lives she could not reconstruct from what they had left behind, only register, with a kind of quiet respect, that there had been lives here. And these were what remained. It was on the lowest shelf of the back wall. The last shelf, closest to the floor, set into a slight alcove where the wall met the corner, that she found it. It was set apart from the other things, not loosely placed as though someone had tucked it in as an afterthought, but arranged with a deliberateness that made it different from everything around it, occupying its small portion of the shelf, as though someone had thought carefully about exactly where it should go. It was a bundle roughly the size and shape of a thick hardback book, wrapped in layers of oil paper, the kind that had been used for centuries to protect important documents from moisture, to carry them through winter and flood and the slow, patient damage of time, and tied with a cord that had gone the color of old ivory. Pause. Mio crouched down and looked at it for a moment before she reached for it, which felt like the right thing to do, the right instinct, the same pause you make before reaching for something you sense may be significant. The oil paper was brown and darkened at the folds, and where it had creased over what must have been many, many years, it had cracked slightly and admitted thin, pale stains of damp. Not catastrophic, she could see, not enough to have done real damage, just the ordinary admission of time, finding its way through even the most careful wrapping. She lifted the bundle, and it was lighter than she had expected. Old things so often are, as though they shed weight along with everything else as the years take them. And she carried it to the doorway, to the proper light, and sat down on the wooden threshold within her lap. Breath. The cord came loose with gentle patience. No force required, only a steady, careful working of the knot, which had gone stiff rather than tight. And when it fell away, she set it aside and turned her attention to the layers of oil paper. She peeled them back one at a time. There were 4, she counted, each a slightly different shade of brown, depending on how long it had been pressed against the others. And as she worked, she was thinking in a distant way about the care in this wrapping, about someone standing somewhere with something they meant to protect and taking the time to wrap it properly, to wrap it as though they understood that the wrapping itself was an act of faith. They had wanted this to survive. That was the plain fact of it, evident in every careful layer, that someone had stood somewhere and thought. This must not be lost, and had taken unhurried steps to ensure it was not. Pause. The last layer fell away, and what it had been protecting was a small bound volume. Pages stitched together at the spine in the old manner. The cover a board that had once been darkly lacquered, but was now simply weathered, absorbing the light that fell on it rather than giving any back. The cover bore water damage in one corner, a wide pale tide mark, evidence of some long ago damp, some winter that had found its way through the wrapping in spite of everything. And along the bottom edge the insects had done their patient small work. The paper there slightly frilled and thinned, the corner bitten gently away over what must have been a very long time. She tilted the cover toward the light, trying to read what was left of the writing on it, and she could make out some characters, brushstrokes dense and careful. The ink faded to something close to the color of the wood behind it, and enough of them to understand that this was a personal document, handwritten, and old in a way that placed it in a different category from anything else she had found on the shelves. She opened it to the first page. The paper inside had been better protected than the cover. The oil paper wrapping had done its work, had held across whatever years and damp and shifts of season had pressed against it. And though the pages were yellowed and stiff in the particular way of paper that has been flat and undisturbed for a very long time, the ink here was more legible, fine brushwork running in careful columns from right to left in the old manner. Each character placed with a deliberateness she could feel even at a distance. Pause. Mio had studied classical Japanese at university, part of a history degree that had seemed impractical at the time and had turned out to be impractical in most of the ways she had expected, and useful in ways she had not. And she sat in the warm afternoon light of the doorway and began slowly to read. The first line was a form of address, written at the very top of the first column in brushwork, slightly more careful and slightly more deliberate than the lines that followed, as though the writer had known it was the most important line, the one that had to be precisely right. It resolved itself, as she worked through it, into 4 characters, meaning, to whoever reads this. She stopped on those words and stayed with them for a moment, the way you stop when something addresses you directly when you had not expected to be addressed. Long pause. To whoever reads this, not to a son or a daughter or a specific named person awaiting a letter, but to whoever, an unknown person at an unknown distance in time, a reader who could not be named because they did not yet exist or existed so far forward as to be entirely invisible from the writer's position, the same way the writer was invisible from theirs. She moved to the second line, the brushwork here a little smaller and denser. You carry my blood. And she sat with that sentence the way she had sat with the first, held it quietly. Because it was simply true, she understood that immediately this was not sentiment or ceremony, but a statement of lineage that applied to her as directly and completely as it applied to anyone. She was here because of whoever had written this, because of their existence and their survival and the chain of births and deaths and ordinary days that had carried the family forward from then to now, from the hand. Holding the brush to the hand, holding the book. She thought about blood in the way that sentence had suddenly made blood present to her, not as a metaphor or a sentiment, but as a physical fact, as something that moves through time inside bodies, passed from generation to generation, the way a lamp is passed from hand to hand in a long, quiet procession, each hand receiving it warm and passing it on warm, all the way from then to now, all the way from him to her. Pause. The summer insects continued in the grass beyond the open door, their soft, continuous sound quite unconcerned with what was happening in the doorway, with the document in her lap, or the centuries it had crossed to arrive there. She read the third line. It was shorter than the others, only a handful of characters, and they resolved themselves, as she worked through them slowly, into a sentence that seemed to her to have been chosen with great care. Chosen for its plainness, she thought, for its refusal of consolation, for the quality of saying exactly what was true without any of the conventional formulas that usually soften these things. I've been dead far longer than you have been alive. She read it a second time, and then a third, the words moving through her without settling anywhere immediately, too large perhaps for quick settling, requiring instead a different kind of receiving, not comprehension exactly, more like standing in a doorway while something large passes through it, and you step aside, and it passes, and you stand there in the altered air. Pause. What was doing something unusual to the light and the air, and the particular nature of this afternoon, she thought, was the directness of it. Not the conventional, by now many years will have passed, or you are reading this in a time far distant from mine, but simply I've been dead far longer than you have been alive, a sentence that placed death on the table plainly and without apology, that acknowledged the full gulf of time between them without trying to make it smaller or more comfortable. It was a plain man's sentence. She found herself thinking, the sentence of someone who had long since made a kind of peace with death by the simple method of calling it by its name. She looked up from the page and out past the threshold, past the long grass of the garden and the dark line of cedars at the property's edge, toward the mountains that stood in the middle distance the way they always stood, blue-gray in the summer heat, enormous and patient. Breath. He had looked at those mountains, or mountains very like them. She found herself thinking this, the thought arriving unbidden, and then, once arrived, feeling simply factual, and had written under them somewhere, in a room or a building that had long since returned to the earth, and left no evidence of having been. 400 years was the phrase that came to her, and she held it as carefully as she was holding the book, feeling its weight, which was the weight of something almost too large to hold in mind as a single thing. 30 generations, roughly, each one a full life, a full world, a full set of seasons, and smaller griefs and ordinary mornings, and she let herself feel the largeness of it rather than reducing it to something more manageable. And yet here was this document, which had crossed all of that, carried forward through all those years in its careful wrapping, waiting on a shelf in this storehouse, and had arrived not in a museum or a scholar's archive, but in her lap, in the afternoon light, in the hands of precisely the person to whom it had, in its patient way, been written. Pause. She thought. He knew someone would come. Not when, not who, not what kind of world they would be living in, or what tools they might use to read his handwriting. None of that was knowable, but he had known, or hoped with enough certainty to be worth calling knowledge, that someone would come, because blood is a river and rivers keep moving forward. And so he had wrapped the pages and placed them on the shelf and trusted the years to carry them to whoever was meant to receive them. She did not yet know who he was, this person who had written to her across 4 centuries. Not his name, not the shape of his life, not what the story inside these pages was. And all of that was in the columns ahead, the dense, careful brushwork waiting the way written things wait, without impatience, without urgency, simply there. She wrapped the volume gently in its layers of oil paper again, smoothing each one down with the flat of her palm, and there was something in the act of wrapping it again that felt right. Not sealing it away, but caring for it the same way it had been cared for, continuing the long custody of it by one more pair of hands. Pause. The light in the garden had shifted while she had been sitting here, moved from the bright high light of late morning to something longer and more oblique, the kind of light that arrives in the late afternoon and makes everything cast long shadows and glow at its edges. And she was aware of having lost track of time, not unpleasantly, in the way you lose it when something has made the ordinary scale of the day feel temporarily beside the point. She rose from the threshold and stood for a moment in the doorway, looking back into the storehouse at the shelf she had not yet reached. All the boxes and bundles still waiting, dim in the back of the building, and all of it was as patient as it had been when she arrived, as patient as it had been for however many years before she arrived. She locked the door behind her and walked back up through the garden toward the house, the memoir tucked carefully under her arm, and the 3 sentences moving with her in the quiet way of things that have arrived and intend to stay. To whoever reads this, pause. You carry my blood. I've been dead far longer than you have been alive. She went inside and set the memoir on the kitchen table, and she made tea the way she always made tea. The small familiar task of measuring the leaves, the sound of the kettle, the smell of the steam rising. And she sat down across from the wrapped book and looked at it while the water cooled to the right temperature and the leaves steeped. She thought about what it meant to be addressed by someone who could not have known you, could not have imagined you, had only trusted that somewhere in the river of blood moving forward from them there would eventually be someone who would find this and sit with it, and read, someone who would understand, at least in part, that they were the intended. There was a quality of gift in it, she thought. Not a gift chosen for a specific person with specific tastes in mind, but something more like a message placed in the current of a river and released with a particular kind of trust that asks for nothing in return, the kind that only wants the message to arrive, and arrive it had for 100 years later into a summer afternoon and a cup of cooling tea. Pause. The room was quiet in the early evening except for the sound coming through the window. Cicadas, a crow somewhere in the cedars, the occasional low creak of the old house adjusting itself to the falling temperature, the small sounds of the building that has stood long enough to have opinions about the weather. And in the evening, after the washing up, with the lamp on low and the night outside, making the window into a dark mirror, she opened the memoir again to the first page and read those 3 lines once more. And this time they did not require the long pause they had required before. They simply settled the way things settle when they have come home. Breath. And that, perhaps, is where we leave her for tonight. At the kitchen table in the lamplight, in the hills outside Nagano, with a dead man's words resting quietly in her hands, having waited 400 years for exactly this and finding at last that the wait was worth it. And so we leave that hallway behind, let it fade the way a dream fades when you reach for it too quickly. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one now, a slow breath in and a long, unhurried breath out. The night is patient. It has nowhere else to be. Our next story continues in that same still darkness, the same quiet hour unfolding around you, soft and unhurried as the space between one heartbeat and the next. You need only listen or simply let the words drift past you like water. Either way, you are exactly where you're meant to be. There was snow on the morning in question, not the heavy, transforming kind that rewrites the world overnight, but the quiet, settled kind, the sort that arrives without announcement in the small hours and lies across the yard by morning looking almost apologetic, as though it had not meant to make so much trouble for everyone. Takashi was 9 years old that winter, or perhaps 10. He would never be entirely certain because no one in his household had been very careful about such things, and the winters ran together in memory the way cold water runs when it spills from a cup, each one indistinguishable from the last, until something particular marks it, something that stays. What he was certain about was the cold, which was its own very specific kind. The kind that lives in the hands before the rest of the body is properly awake. The kind that makes the world feel as though it belongs to someone older and more accustomed to difficulty than a small person standing in a yard at dawn has any right to be. The axe was leaning against the woodpile when he came outside, already crusted along the handle with a thin line of frost, and the blade caught what little gray light the morning offered and gave nothing back. It was not a large axe, as axes go, quite modest, in fact, a working tool and nothing more, but in Takashi's hands, which were still a child's hands, with the palms still smooth in the way children's palms are smooth before life gets to work on them. The axe felt very large and very cold and very much like an argument he had not asked to be part of. He had been told to split the wood. The same instruction that came each morning when there was wood that needed splitting, which in a household like theirs, in a winter like that one, was nearly every morning without exception. He stood in the yard and looked at the woodpile, and then at the axe, and then at the sky, which was the color of an old cloth and offered him nothing useful. No encouragement, no excuse, only more gray and the faint suggestion that more snow might arrive before the day was done. And then he did what children do when faced with a task they do not want to begin. He simply remained where he was, in the particular stillness that is not stillness at all, but is really the body's best argument against starting, the legs and hands quietly conspiring with each other to stay exactly where they were. The cold worked steadily into his feet through the worn cloth of his socks, and still he stood, and the woodpile waited with the patient indifference of woodpiles, and the axe leaned against it with the unhurried air of something that had all morning and was prepared to use it. He told himself, as children do, that he would start in just one more moment, and one moment became several, and several became something that felt, even to a 9-year-old standing in the cold, less like resting and more like refusing, the distinction growing harder to pretend he did not notice. He thought about the warmth inside the house, about the space beside the hearth where the air held the previous night's fire and smelled of cedar and smoke, and thought about how unfair it was that wood did not split itself, that cold did not arrange for its own remedy, that the world placed this particular burden on a person of his particular and unreasonable smallness. His eyes had begun the preliminary work they do before something real arrives. The slight reddening at the edges, the brightness that was not happiness. And altogether the picture he made, standing in the yard with the axe leaning forgotten beside him, was the picture of a child who had decided, without quite deciding, that this particular morning was simply too much. And that was when the door opened. He heard it before he saw anything. The familiar lift of the latch, the small complaint of the hinges that had needed attention for longer than anyone could remember, and then the careful sound of his father's step on the wooden board outside, the particular uneven rhythm that Takashi had known since before he had words for things. One foot, then the other, then a slight pause, then the next. Kenji moved across the yard with the care of a man who has learned, over many years and through a great deal of pain, exactly how to manage whatever surface the world places beneath him. The precise weight of each step, the small adjustment when snow covered what lay underneath, the way a body learns to arrange itself around an old wound so that the wound becomes part of the arrangement rather than merely an obstacle. He was not a large man. Takashi's father probably never had been, and the years since the war had taken something from him that was not only physical, the way long, hard years do, and yet there was something in the way he held himself, even crossing a small snowy yard on a cold morning, that did not invite the kind of looking that is really pity wearing a different coat. He came and stood beside the woodpile and looked at the axe, and then at the wood, and then at his son standing between them with the expression of a person who has lost an argument with himself and is not quite ready to admit it. And his face held something that was not anger. What it held instead was something quieter and harder to argue with, a kind of recognition, as though Kenji had seen this moment before, or something very like it, perhaps from the other side of the yard, perhaps from inside a very similar small person who had also stood in the cold once and found the argument for beginning very difficult to locate. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The yard was very quiet in the way that yards are quiet under fresh snow, the snow absorbing what little sound the world was making without returning anything, so that even the ordinary sounds of the household filtered through muffled and distant and gentle. Then Kenji bent, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man who has learned that bending is not something to be done without thought, and he picked up the axe and held it briefly in his own hands, and then he turned to his son and held it out, not with impatience, and not with frustration. He held it out the way you offer something to someone you love that you know will be heavy for them, with a gentleness that acknowledges the weight without apologizing for it. Takashi took it. There was no real way not to when something is offered like that, with that particular quality, and the weight settled into his cold palms, and his fingers wrapped around the handle, and the frost on the wood bit lightly at his skin, and he stood there holding it, still not entirely persuaded that holding a thing meant you had to do anything further with it. His father's hands, which had placed the axe into his, did not move away immediately. They rested for a moment over Takashi's own, the way hands sometimes rest when they're trying to pass something that cannot be passed in a single motion, something that requires a beat of stillness before it settles where it needs to settle. The hands were rough, his father's hands, crossed with calluses in the way that hands become when they have done long work over a long time. And they were warm, which surprised Takashi slightly, because the morning was genuinely cold and warmth seemed like a thing that should have stayed indoors on such a morning. And then Kenji spoke, and his voice was low, not hushed the way voices go when something is being kept secret, but low in the way a voice goes when it has found the right register for what it carries, when it does not want to add to the words anything the words are not already holding on their own. He spoke of blades, that a blade was made for cutting, which Takashi had understood in the way children understand obvious things. But then his father said something further, something the child had not expected, and the weight of the axe shifted slightly in his hands, even though nothing about the axe itself had changed. He told his son, standing there in the snow with his bad leg and his old coat and his voice that did not rise or hurry, that the first thing a person who holds a blade must cut is his own softness, not kindness, not warmth, not the ability to feel things. Those were different and worth keeping. But the softness that says the morning is too cold, the work is too heavy, the yard is too far from the fire, the task is too much for a person of your particular and unfortunate smallness. That softness, his father spoke quietly, was the first thing the blade was for. Takashi stood with the axe in his hands, and the words finding their way into him the way snow finds its way into things, without forcing, settling into the spaces already there waiting to receive something, beginning even in that first moment to become part of the landscape of him. He did not entirely understand. He was 9, or perhaps 10, and full understanding was not yet available to him. But he understood enough, in the way children sometimes understand things before the words for them have arrived, absorbing the sense before the meaning comes. He understood that his father was not speaking about wood, not about this particular yard and these particular logs and this particular cold morning, except in the way that all particular things are also about more general things when the right person says them at the right moment in the right voice. He lifted the axe, and he split the first piece of wood, and it was not graceful. He was small, and the axe was heavy, and the log cracked apart at an angle rather than cleanly, not the way his father would have done it, but it split, and the sound of it rang out across the quiet yard and was absorbed immediately by the snow, and there was a kind of satisfaction in that sound that surprised him. His father watched him for a little while, saying nothing more. There was nothing more to say, and Kenji was not a man who added words to things already complete. And then he turned and went back inside, his uneven step crossing the snow again, the door opening and closing behind him with its small familiar complaint. Takashi stayed in the yard and split the rest of the wood, piece by piece, his breath coming in small clouds in the cold air, his hands reddening around the handle, the pile of split wood growing slowly beside him in the gray morning light, log by log, imperfectly, steadily, in the cold. It was not a dramatic thing, just a boy splitting wood in a yard, just a task being completed, just a morning passing the way mornings pass. And yet something had shifted inside him, some small weight had moved from one place to another, and the cold did not feel quite as cold as it had before he began. That winter was a long one, persistent in the way of winters that are not in any hurry, thinning very slowly, until one morning the cold has simply become something you live beside rather than something you push back against. But Kenji did not thin with it, and the household arranged itself around his declining rest in the quiet way that households learn to do, without ceremony and without being asked. Takashi noticed the change in his father, the way children notice things they are not quite ready to assemble into a whole, in pieces, sideways, without letting the pieces find their proper arrangement, because some pictures are easier to leave incomplete for a little while longer. He noticed that his father sat longer before rising in the mornings, and that the warmth in those hands had taken on a different quality now. The warmth of something working harder than it should be working, the warmth of effort rather than ease. He noticed that some evenings his father would look into the fire the way people look at things when they're not really seeing them, when the eyes are simply a useful place to rest while the mind travels somewhere it does not describe. So instead of asking, he did what the household had taught him. He continued, splitting the wood each morning without being told now, stacking it carefully against the house with a precision his father would have recognized, the logs fitting neatly against each other, the stack taller than it strictly needed to be, as though the height of it were itself a kind of insistence, a quiet argument made to no one in particular. The axe grew more familiar in his hands across those weeks, the frost on the handle no longer biting quite the same way, the weight distributing itself differently as his arms learned what to do with it. Not mastery, not yet, but the beginning of an understanding between a person and a tool. He thought often, on those mornings in the yard, about the sentence his father had given him, turning it the way you turn a stone in the hand to see all of its surfaces, and it seemed to him each time that the sentence was not finished, that something inside it kept opening outward whenever he pressed gently against it. When his father died, it was one of those ordinary mornings that is only extraordinary afterward. The same gray sky, the same cold air, the familiar sounds of the yard, and then a particular quiet settling into the house that was different from other quiets, the kind you know before anyone has said anything at all. Takashi had been outside when it happened, and he came in to find the stillness. And he understood it the way you understand certain things without needing them explained. And he went to where his father lay and sat beside him for a while without speaking, because there was nothing that speaking would have helped. His father's hands were folded at rest, and they were cold now, those hands, the warmth entirely gone. The warmth that had surprised him on that snowy morning somewhere the living do not follow, and Takashi sat beside the cold hands and let the morning be what it was. He kept the axe. This goes without saying, perhaps, but it is worth saying. He kept it long past the point where a practical person would have replaced the handle. Long into the years when it had become something slightly other than a tool, something that carried in its frost worn with the memory of a particular morning and a voice that had not hurried. He carried the sentence the way his father had carried the wound from the old war. Not as a burden, not exactly, but as something that had arrived through difficulty and stayed, that had worked itself into how he moved through the world, so gradually he could no longer find the self that had existed before it. Over the years, he came to feel that his father had not meant hardness, had not been recommending the removal of tenderness from a life, the silencing of the capacity to feel the weight of a morning, but something more precise, more difficult, and in the end, more useful. The softness that finds reasons not to begin, that looks at the cold yard and the heavy axe and the distance to the fire and adds them all into an argument for waiting, for asking someone else, for letting the morning pass without being asked anything of it. That softness, and only that softness, was what the sentence had been reaching for. He would think of his father on many mornings in the years that followed, on the gray mornings with no encouragement, on the mornings when what was required of him seemed larger than what he had to offer, when the frost was on the ground and some part of him wanted nothing more than to stand very still and let the moment pass. On those mornings, he would feel somewhere in his chest the weight of the axe being placed into his hands, the specific weight of it, the frost on the handle, the warmth that had surprised him by covering his cold fingers and holding them briefly before withdrawing. And something inside him would settle, the way snow settles, quietly and without drama. And then he would begin, which is perhaps all his father had ever been asking of him. In the end, simply to pick up the thing that needed picking up, to let the first stroke land, and then the second, to trust that the rest would follow from an honest beginning made in the cold. His father's grave was small, and the moss covered it quickly, as moss does in that part of the country, settling over the stone until the stone itself seemed almost secondary, the real memorial being something carried rather than placed, something that lived inside rather than rested on a hillside under the open sky. Somewhere in the chest of a boy who had stood in the yard refusing the morning, who had been given one sentence and an axe, and the surprising warmth of his father's hands over his own small hands. Kenji's voice still moved, low and unhurried, saying the one thing it had said, still warm in the way those hands had been warm that morning, improbably and quietly and without apology. And that, perhaps, is where the story of that morning rests. Not in the grave or the axe or the snow that lay over both the yard and the hillside with the same quiet impartiality, but in the simple fact of a child beginning, picking up what was placed in his hands in the cold and starting to cut. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet shadows folding back into the dark where memories live. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one. Let your breath come slow and easy. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting tonight. The night is long, and it holds many rooms. Our next story takes us there still. The same story continuing, the same night unfolding, patient as the hour itself. So brief, let the silence settle around you like something warm. When you are ready, and there is no rush, we will step gently forward into what comes next. Somewhere in the slow unfolding of that early spring, a boy named Takashi arrived at the castle gates with nothing but a cloth bundle over one shoulder and the particular silence of someone who has recently said goodbye to everything he had known. He was 15 years old, and he stood in the outer courtyard looking up at the stone walls for long enough that a gatekeeper came over and asked, in a mild and unhurried way, if he was lost. He was not lost. Pause. He had, in fact, been walking toward this place for 3 days, and he knew very well where he was. It was simply that arriving somewhere you have never been tends to require a moment of adjustment, a breath between the anticipation and the actual. No one inside those walls seemed in any particular hurry, which was either reassuring or its own kind of warning. and Takashi stood there long enough to decide it was probably both. The castle was held by a lord named Daichi, whose reputation in the villages surrounding the valley was that he never once raised his voice. People passed this on in a tone that suggested they were not entirely certain whether it was a virtue or a troubling sign. And Takashi, following the gatekeeper across the courtyard, was beginning to understand why. A man who shouts tells you where he stands. Pause. A man who is always quiet asks you to listen very carefully for something that may never quite arrive. Takashi was assigned a sleeping mat in the outer barracks, a position at the lowest rank of foot soldiers, the Ishigaru, which you might translate loosely as light feet, though there was nothing particularly light about what would be asked of them, and a spear. The spear was older than he was, its wooden shaft worn dark and smooth by however many hands had gripped it before his, and it was heavier than it looked, the way many things that have done real work in the world tend to be. Pause. Drill began the next morning before the sky had quite finished deciding whether to be light, and the instructor, a man of middling years and considerable patience, the kind that is not warmth, but rather the long discipline of having explained the same things a great many times, walked up and down the line of new recruits without saying anything at first. There were perhaps a dozen of them, all roughly Takashi's age, all carrying that same quality of uncertain stillness, and they stood in a row and waited for something to happen. Breath. Then the instructor explained, in a voice both flat and precise, exactly where to place the hands. Not in the center of the palm, where the grip would slide and blister, but in the fold where the fingers met the hand, the weight distributed evenly across the whole, steady as a fence post in winter ground. Takashi listened carefully. Pause. He did not hold it the right way. No one did, not at first, because knowing where to hold something and actually being able to hold it, there are two entirely different orders of knowledge. And the body has its own schedule for learning, which is always slower than the mind and considerably less impressed by instruction. By the third morning, the blisters had arrived, soft and bright at the base of his fingers. And by the end of the first week, they had opened, and the skin beneath was raw and warm and tight, and the old dark wood of the spear shaft had taken on a new quality, a faint stain, a warmth that was partly his, that Takashi noticed each morning when he picked it up and tried not to think about too carefully. He did try not to think about all the other pairs of hands whose warmth had gone into that wood before his, and where those hands were now. The instructor did not comment on the bleeding. Long pause. He simply walked the line, corrected the grip here and the posture there, and moved on, and the days accumulated quietly around that steady repetition. Lord Daichi appeared in the training yard only once in those first weeks, on a morning when a cold sideways rain had started and the recruits had all silently decided, without discussing it, that the rain was not quite bad enough to mention. He stood at the edge of the yard for perhaps 10 minutes, watching the line of boys work through their drills, and then he walked away without a word, his conclusions kept entirely to himself. Pause. Takashi watched him go and noticed that Daichi moved the way very still water moves. Not slow exactly, but unhurried in a way that suggested the hurrying had been done long ago, and the results had not been worth remembering. He had heard it said that Daichi had survived a number of engagements in his younger years without particular incident, and that this was considered either very skilled or very fortunate, and possibly neither. Takashi was 15, and he was still at the age when the most interesting thing about a lord was whether he was impressive, and Daichi was not impressive in any way he had been taught to recognize. It would be some time before he understood that this was in itself a kind of answer. Pause. The recruit Takashi first noticed as a distinct individual rather than simply another figure in the general chorus of shivering young men, was a boy named Run. Rin noticed him first, which was perhaps the more significant fact. Breath. On the 5th day, in the brief rest between the morning's drill and the afternoon's cleaning duties, Rin sat down beside him against the barracks wall, unwrapped a cloth bundle that held 2 rice balls, and held one out without any ceremony whatsoever. Takashi looked at it for a moment. He had been raised in a household where you thought carefully before accepting things from strangers, and his hands hurt, and the rice ball was small, and he was trying to determine what came with it. Rin waited with the patience of someone who was not particularly patient, but had decided to appear so, which is sometimes the more effective approach, and did not take the rice ball back. Takashi took it. Pause. It was a small thing, and he was very hungry, and it tasted the way rice balls taste when someone else has made them, of salt and care and the mild melancholy of a meal eaten far from the place where it was prepared. For a moment, he felt something in his chest loosen by one small degree, the way a fist unclenches when the threat turns out to be smaller than expected. Rin introduced himself between bites. From a village 3 days east, his mother had packed pickled plums because she didn't trust the castle to feed him properly, and so far she had not been entirely wrong. And he relayed all of this with the easy cadence of someone who has been talking to new people his whole life and finds it mostly fine. Takashi offered his own name and where he was from, and not much else, because he was not yet sure how much of himself to give over to someone he had known for fewer than 5 days. Rin did not seem to require more. Pause. He simply finished his rice ball, looked out at the courtyard with the mild equanimity of a person who is good at occupying quiet spaces, and sat there without making Takashi feel responsible for filling the silence. This, Takashi would come to understand later, was one of Rin's most genuine qualities. The ability to be present in silence without turning it into a problem. Pause. The afternoon went its usual course, scrubbing, carrying, standing in a row for more instruction, the body doing what it was told while the mind wandered carefully in the small space it was allowed. By evening, the recruits had arrived at something that served as free time, which mostly meant gathering near the iron braziers in the outer yard and coaxing the feeling back into their hands. The braziers were wide and heavy and generous with their heat, throwing orange light out into the cooling air without judgment or restraint, and the darkness gathering at the edges of the yard had the quality of early spring evenings that have not yet decided to be fully cold or fully mild. One by one, the other boys drifted over and settled into the familiar posture of people who are tired and warm in the presence of fire, slightly slack, eyes half soft, the day releasing its grip a little at a time. Pause. Rin appeared and sat down beside Takashi again. which no longer felt like coincidence. He had somehow produced another rice ball. Or perhaps this was the same supply managed with more foresight than was immediately obvious. And he offered half without breaking the mood of the evening, which was quiet and warm and moving slowly towards settled. Takashi accepted without the pause of the first time. They sat with the fire between them and the night coming in from the edges of the yard, the castle rising above them in the dark, its stone walls holding the cold even as the brazier held the warmth, and the smoke went up in a thin, lazy column toward a sky not yet fully decided on stars. Long pause. Rin began to talk in the unhurried way he had about his father's land, a small plot east of the village, just sufficient to be considered farming in the way that is more habit than profession, with a rice field that was enthusiastic in wet years and philosophical in dry ones, and 2 goats who had strong feelings about nearly everything. He said that when all of this was finished, castle service, drill, whatever came after the thing that came after the thing, he intended to go back to that land and make something real of it. A real farm, he told Takashi, the kind his father had meant to build and hadn't quite gotten to, with the lower field finally cleared, the one that had been on the agenda for years, the way things are when they are important but not urgent enough to reach the front of the line, and proper rice in good rows, and everything in its place. Pause. He was going to have 7 children. He added, stating this number with the calm certainty of a man who has done thorough arithmetic and arrived at a satisfying answer. 7 was enough to fill a table without losing track of the names, he observed, and enough to make sure there was always someone left to do the part of the work you most didn't want to do. Takashi listened to all of this and found himself trying to picture it. The cleared field, the rows of rice, the 7 children who existed somewhere in a future version of time where all of this, the aching hands, the cold mornings, the weight of the spear handle, had already been passed through and left behind. The fire shifted with a soft sound and sent up a brief scatter of sparks that rose and went dark before reaching anywhere, and Takashi watched them without hurry. Breath. Rin asked what Takashi wanted when it was over. It was a direct question, offered in the same easy manner as everything Rin said, and Takashi sat with it for longer than was strictly comfortable, long enough that Rin tilted his head slightly with the patience of someone who is genuinely curious and therefore willing to wait. The honest answer was that Takashi had not thought about after in any concrete way. He had thought about surviving, about not bringing shame to the memory of his father, about doing whatever was asked of him carefully and without complaint, but none of these were future in the way Rin's 7 children on a cleared lower field was a future. Pause. He did not say this. He turned it over for another moment, watching the fire work through its small, bright calculations, and then he said, slowly, testing the shape of the words as they arrived, that he supposed he would live next to Ren's farm. He said it plainly, without embellishment, not because he had thought of something better and was choosing brevity, but because when he tried to look at the other side of all of this, the clearest image his mind could produce was exactly that. Ren's farm, the cleared field, the loud, crowded meals, and something nearby that was his. Pause. Something small and sufficient. There was a pause, The kind that happens just before a person realizes something is more delightful than expected. And then Wren laughed. Not a polite laugh, not the short sound of acknowledgement, but a full and genuine laugh, unguarded and slightly too loud for the quiet of the yard, and he didn't appear to notice or mind that several of the other boys near the fire glanced over. It was a warm sound, round and easy and somewhat surprised by itself, the way laughter sometimes sounds when something lands better than it had any right to. Pause. The other boys looked over, found nothing alarming, and returned to their own conversations, and the evening settled back into its own quiet sounds. The occasional soft shift of the brazier, the distant movement of the gate, the low murmur of the castle going about its night. Takashi found that he was smiling, which surprised him in a mild and pleasant way, the way surprising yourself with a feeling you didn't expect tends to do. He was still smiling when the laughter finished, and after that they sat in the particular companionable quiet that comes to two people who have arrived, without quite intending to, at something comfortable, the fire between them, the night cool at their backs, the castle immense and old above them in the dark. His palms still ached, the split skin tight and warm, the wood stain already darkening from red to the color of old work. But sitting by that fire with the sound of Wren's laugh still settling somewhere in the evening air, the aching felt different, the way pain does when you are not carrying it entirely alone. Breath. He looked at his hands in the firelight, the blisters beginning their slow transformation into callus, the particular marks of a grip not yet mastered, the small patient evidence that the body was already starting to learn what the mind had been told and had not yet understood. He thought, briefly and without urgency, about the spear leaning against the barracks wall across the yard. Old wood, other hands, other blood dried to the same quiet color, patient as old things tend to be. He thought about Lord Daichi, who had stood in the rain that morning and watched them all without comment and walked away, keeping his conclusions in that deep internal place where men who never raise their voices keep everything. Pause. And he thought, as he often did at the edges of the day, about his father, about hands that had known this kind of work, about a voice that stayed low even when it might have risen, about a sentence he had kept close because there had been nothing else to keep. These thoughts came and went the way the sparks did, brief, warm, gone before they landed anywhere. Beside him, Wren was growing quiet, his breathing long and easy, the look on his face that of someone who has settled a question and no longer needs to stay entirely awake. Pause. 7 children, Takashi thought, turning the number over gently in no particular direction, and himself nearby, in something small on his own, close enough to hear the meals and not quite be in them. It was not a plan, but it was something to turn toward in the dark, which is not the same thing as a plan and is sometimes more useful. The fire burned a little lower, and some on the far side of the brazier added a piece of wood that caught with a soft surge of new orange, and the castle walls held the light briefly before returning to their patience. And the smoke rose slow and unhurried into the night, and the stars were coming now, one at a time, finding their places in the usual way they do when no one is rushing them. Pause. He thought about the spear handle one more time, the blood that had dried there that week, the way the wood had taken it in without complaint, the way the wood would carry it forward now into whatever came next, the same way the wood carry the mark of every boy before him who had gripped it and hurt and kept going. There was something in that, something he could not yet name, but could feel the shape of, the way you can feel the shape of a stone in your hand in the dark without being able to say what color it is. And perhaps that was enough for now, to feel the shape of something, even if the name for it was still a long way off. That is the particular mercy of being 15 and new to a place. The not yet knowing is not a lack, not quite, but a kind of open space, and the evening fills it gently. Pause. And that is the thing about evenings like that one. The kind that happen when you're young and have not yet learned how much of what you feel now you will carry forward. You cannot know, sitting there by the fire, that the warmth of it will stay. That the sound of a laugh from someone beside you on a cold spring evening will be one of the things you reach for later in harder weather, when you need something solid to hold. You just feel warm and a little less alone, and the night comes in softly, and sleep is somewhere very close now, moving through the yard like smoke, finding the boys one by one. And so Takashi settled a little, and the fire settled with him, and somewhere in the middle of a thought about a cleared lower field and a house not yet built and a future still entirely open, he let the evening have him and rested. Pause. And that, perhaps, is where this night comes to rest. A boy with aching hands and borrowed warmth, sitting at the edge of a fire that asked nothing of him, while somewhere behind him in the dark the spear waited, patient as old wood always is, against the wall. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet shadows folding gently closed, like pages of a book set down for the night. There is no need to hurry anywhere. If you like, take a slow breath now. In through the nose and let it go, and feel the weight of your body settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The same story is still with us. The same night still unfolding, soft and unhurried, carrying us forward the way a slow river carries a leaf, without effort, without asking anything of you at all. Simply let the words come, and let them go and drift. In the far corner of a small field encampment, somewhere in the low country south of the river, a young soldier named Takashi sat with his back against a wooden post and his hands resting open in his lap, and his hands would not stop shaking. Pause. The lanterns were burning at the center of the camp, and Takashi had walked away from them, had found a place where their light ran out and the dark was thicker and less inhabited, and sat down, and now the post was solid at his back, and the ground was cold beneath him, and the trembling in his hands continued without asking his permission. He was 19 years old, or somewhere near it. No one had ever kept very careful track of the exact number, and he had been a soldier for 4 years, which is long enough to know the weight of a weapon and the particular silence of men waiting to move, but not long enough to have fully understood what such nights would ask. The skirmish had no name, which happens more often in war than the history's record. There are battles that are written down and given names and remembered, and then there are the smaller, grimmer events, the night engagements in fog, the brief violent misunderstandings at the edges of unnamed fields that leave nothing behind except the people who were there. Takashi had been there, in one of those unnamed things, less than an hour ago, and now he sat in the dark beyond the lanterns with his hands open in his lap, and the trembling moving through them like water that could not decide where to settle. Pause. The order to move had come just before midnight, passed down the line of men as a whisper, and Takashi remembered lacing his sandals in the dark, the specific, particular care he had taken with them, the way his fingers had been deliberate and unhurried with the knots, as though the sandals were the thing that mattered most. He would remember this for a long time. The sandals, the care, the cold air on his hands while he worked, because the mind does that, sometimes holds very tightly to something small and manageable when it knows, somewhere beneath language, what the next hour is preparing to ask of you. The fog had been building all evening, rising from the wet, low ground in slow waves. And by the time they moved through the tree-line, it had thickened to the point where the soldier 2 paces ahead of him was little more than a shape, a dark suggestion of a shoulder, an edge of cloth moving through the white. Takashi had kept his eyes on that shape and followed it the way you follow a lamp at a very great distance, grateful for its presence, not requiring it to know where it was going, simply needing it to be there ahead of him in the dark. Ren was somewhere to his left, he thought, somewhere in the fog and the line of men, and not knowing exactly where was one of those quiet miseries that soldiers learn to carry, the not knowing where the person you would most want near you actually is at the moment you most want them near. Pause. The fog made sounds strange, muffled some things and carried others in unpredictable ways, and what Takashi heard as he walked was a kind of irregular quiet, punctuated by footsteps and the soft movement of equipment, and somewhere in the trees, nothing he could name. The line slowed and then stopped, and Takashi stood in the white with his hands already trembling, the body knowing before the mind does, giving away what the rest of him was still trying to manage. And then the man came out of the white. That is the only way he would ever describe it, on the rare occasions when he described it at all. The man came out of the white, because there is no better way to say how a person resolves from fog, how the uncertain and shapeless suddenly become specific and near and present. Pause. He was young. That was the first thing, the thing Takashi noticed even then, even in that moment. Young in the same way Takashi was young, not greatly, but enough that the fear was plainly visible in the eyes, the kind of fear that has not yet become anything harder or more resolved. They were close enough to see each other's faces clearly, and Takashi saw that the other man's shoulders were trembling, a small and involuntary quaking that the body produces when it is telling the truth it cannot stop telling, and knew, with complete certainty, that his own trembling was visible in exactly the same way. Both of them had their weapons at the ready, and both of them were still, and the fog moved between them without preference, slow and pale, and from some distance away, far enough to feel almost abstract, came the sounds of the rest of the skirmish conducting itself in the dark. But in the particular circle of fog that contained just the two of them, there was only the trembling and the white and the sound of 2 young men breathing with great effort at steadiness. Pause. There was a moment, and this is the moment Takashi would turn over and examine for the rest of his life, The way you examine something you've been carrying for so long you no longer notice its weight until one day you sit on a table and look at it. There was a moment when neither of them moved, when the fog held everything suspended and the night had not yet decided. He would search his memory later for the exact instant where he chose, the specific moment that divided what he had been from what he became, where there was still a clean before, and he would never find it. The mind does not always make a record of the things it cannot integrate, wraps them instead in the fog's own grammar, a before and an after, and between those two a space that resists description. Breath. What he remembered was the quality of the silence before, the particular texture of the white around him, and then the silence after, and between those two silences something that could not be retrieved, something the fog moved quietly around, and then closed behind, the way water closes over a stone dropped from a bridge. The man went down without a sound, which is something that surprises people who have not been near it. How quiet some endings are, how little noise they require, how complete they are in their brevity, how the world continues its usual sounds immediately after, without any pause. He folded was the word Takashi would find later, sitting in the dark with Run beside him, searching for the simplest honest word. He folded the way a thing folds when whatever was holding it upright is simply no longer there. And then the fog moved in between them, and Takashi was alone in the white again, and around him the night went on in exactly the way it had been going, because for the night, in the broad and indifferent sense, nothing had changed. Pause. He made his way back toward the camp the way he had moved through the field, following shapes he could barely see, putting one foot after another on ground that felt less reliable than it had an hour before, as though the earth itself had become slightly uncertain. The camp was small, a cluster of lanterns and bedrolls, and the smell of horses and cold rice and wood smoke. The ordinary smell of men in a field, which was familiar in a way that should have been steadying, and was not quite, not yet, not tonight. He found the far corner, where the light did not reach, and sat down against a post, and his body made up his mind about what happened next in the way bodies will when they have been asked to absorb more than they know how to manage. They simply do what they need to do, quietly, without consulting anyone. He was sick, there in the dark beyond the lanterns, thoroughly and without any dignity at all, and he was grateful in an immediate and uncomplicated way for the aloneness, for the specific mercy that no one was there to see it. Pause. When it was over, he sat with his back against the post and let the post carry some of his weight, and he was very aware of the wood behind him, the specific grain of it, the way it was solid and unyielding without being unkind, and he was aware of the cold ground beneath him, and of his hands still resting open in his lap, still trembling. He looked at his hands for a long time. In the careful, unhurried way, you look at something you're seeing somewhat differently than you have seen it before. And then, because there was nowhere else to look and the night was full, he looked up and noticed the sky. The fog had lifted, apparently, while he was not paying attention. Fog does this, resolves on its own terms, without announcement, in its own quiet time, and the sky above him was dense with stars in a way he was not sure he had ever seen before, a sky so full of them that it seemed slightly wrong, slightly more than was needed. The way a room can be given too many things and tip past abundance into something else. There were so many that they blurred at the edges of his perception, became a general brightness rather than individual points, a vast occupied silence pressing down from above without weight, without intention, without any particular interest in what was taking place beneath them on this specific piece of ground. The stars did not care. This was the thing he noticed sitting there with the cold on his face and the post at his back and the shaking in his hands. The stars burned in the same ancient patterns they had burned in the night before and would burn in long after, and the fog skirmish in the low country had not registered with him at all. Pause. He heard Run before he saw him. The sound of someone picking their way carefully across the camp, the particular slowness of a person who does not want to startle, who approaches with care because they know what they are approaching. Rin sat down beside him without saying anything, close enough that Takashi could feel the warmth of another body in the cold air, that specific and fundamental comfort of another person nearby, which is perhaps the oldest of all comforts, the one that predates language and thought and all the more elaborate forms of kindness. He put his hand on Takashi's back and began moving it in slow circles, unhurried, steady, the way you might ease a child through a bad dream, or settle a frightened horse that has caught some scent it does not know how to name. Pause. He did not ask what had happened, because he knew or could piece together well enough, and asking would have been the wrong kind of attention, would have required Takashi to arrange the night into words before the night was ready to be arranged. Soren simply put his hand on the back of the person beside him and moved it slowly, and was present in the way that some people know how to be present, entirely without reservation, without asking for anything in return, without measuring how long is long enough. The trembling in Takashi's hands continued, and Rin said nothing about it. Pause. Around them, the camp found its nighttime rhythms, the occasional low murmur of men too tired for sleep, but too tired for much else, the shift of a horse in the dark, the small adjustments of wood in a fire, the ambient life of men in a field trying to find their way toward rest. Above them, the stars burned on in their enormous and patient unconcern. Rin had always known when to speak and when not to, which is a quality easy to take for granted in the ordinary hours and impossible to overvalue in moments like this one, when what is needed is not words but their precise and deliberate absence. When he did speak, he spoke in the same register as the camp around them, quiet, unhurried, the voice of someone saying a thing plainly because they believe it and because the person beside them needs to hear it, and not because it is the kind of thing that makes for a fine or memorable statement. Breath. He said that Takashi was allowed to tremble. He said it the way a man says something he has arrived at through his own quiet consideration, without ceremony, without insistence, setting it down gently and leaving it for the other person to take or set aside as they chose. And then, after a moment that was longer than the space between ordinary words, Rin said the thing that Takashi would carry alongside his father's word for the rest of his life. that the day the trembling stopped was the day something truly died. Pause. He did not say it as instruction, and he did not say it exactly as comfort, though it was partly both, because it was not entirely comfortable, and it was not meant to make the night simpler so much as to tell the truth about it, in the plain and unadorned way that some people tell true things when the occasion calls for nothing else. He said it the way a man says something he simply believes, leaving it to land wherever it lands. Takashi said nothing in return, and there was nothing that needed to be said, and the words sat between them in the dark the way certain words do. Not resolved, not concluded, simply present, taking their place among the other things the night already contained. Pause. His mind moved in the way minds move in the dark when they're keeping a respectful distance from something they cannot yet face. Move not toward the fog and the man in it. Not yet, but toward his father, toward a cold morning and a woodpile, and a boy who had not wanted to be there. He found himself remembering the weight of the axe handle in his young hands, and the frost on the split wood, and his father's voice, low and warm in the cold morning, warm the way the fire indoors was warm, saying the one thing it had said about blades and what they were for, the thing he had carried since. He had believed, the first time he heard it, that he understood it. He understood it differently now, sitting in the dark with a hand moving slowly on his back, and too many stars overhead, and the trembling still alive in him. Breath. The man in the fog had been trembling, and Takashi had been trembling, and in the suspended moment before everything closed behind the fog, neither of them had been without softness, and perhaps that softness was not the thing to be cut away, as he had always half imagined, but the thing to be honestly held, the thing that proved something essential was still present. He did not think this clearly in those exact words, sitting in the corner of the camp. He was 19 years old and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, that particular exhaustion of a person who has arrived somewhere unexpected, somewhere that will take a long time to fully enter and cannot be entered all at once, that must be entered in small degrees over the years that follow. Pause. He thought about the other man's eyes. He had not meant to look at them, and now he could not stop seeing them. The fear in them and the recognition, the way fear reflects itself exactly in the face of the person on the other side of it, like a lamp and its double in a window. Not the act itself, which had been brief and which the fog had moved through and then closed over, but the moment before, the two young men standing in the white, both trembling, each able to see clearly in the face of the other something that looked very much like himself. He did not know the man's name, and there was no way he would ever know it, and this settled into him quietly alongside everything else the night was laying down, taking its place without announcement. Long pause. The camp made its nighttime sounds around them. Someone somewhere in the dark laughing very softly at something, the kind of small, late, exhausted laugh that is more release than humor, and the low voices of men who could not sleep, and the horses, and the fire sending its thin column of smoke straight up into the too many stars. Ren's hand continued its slow circles. It had not stopped since he sat down, and it did not rush, and it did not measure how long was long enough, because some kinds of company do not measure. They simply continue in the dark for as long as the dark requires. Pause. Takashi had known Ren for 4 years, had eaten the rice Ren set aside, had listened to the plans for 7 children and wide farm fields, and the future they were going to build if they survived, had laughed alongside him at things that were only partly funny, and had valued all of it in the easy way you value what is ordinary and reliably there. He valued it differently now, sitting in the corner of the camp with the hand on his back. There are people who carry their warmth naturally in ordinary moments. The food offered without ceremony, the easy laughter, the idle talk of futures. And there are people who carry it unchanged into the hard moments as well, who do not find it diminished by difficulty or by dark. And these are not always the same person, but Ren was both. This arrived not as a thought, so much as something felt, something that settled into the space between the stars and the cold ground and the slow circles and the shaking that would not stop. Pause. After a while, and it may have been a long while, the trembling in his hands did begin to ease, not because anything had resolved itself or become clearer, but because the body can sustain a certain intensity only for so long before it releases some of it quietly, without decision, the way a night releases its darkest hour gradually and without announcement. He became aware of the stars again, had not stopped being aware of them, but became aware in a more deliberate way, as though the night had gently redirected his attention. Breath. There were so many that counting them was the kind of thing you began and very quickly abandoned, the way you abandon certain attempts not because they're too large, but because they're too numerous, because the mind reaches for a foothold and finds instead just more and more receding in all directions. He looked at them without counting, with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who has nowhere else to be, who has, for this hour, stopped trying to arrive anywhere. Pause. He thought about how those same stars had burned above this same ground the night before, and would burn above it the night after, and in all the nights that whatever came next would contain, burning in the same ancient patterns with the same vast patience, entirely indifferent to what was happening beneath them on any given piece of earth. This indifference should perhaps have been cold, and in one sense it was, and in another sense it was something like a relief. The universe was very large, and one night in the low country with its fog and its trembling and its particular weight was a very small thing within that largeness. And there was something in this smallness that made it possible, not easy, but possible to hold. Sleep found him from the edges, the way sleep comes when exhaustion has finally worn through whatever was keeping it away, not all at once, but gradually, in a way things come gradually when they are meant to come. Pause. He thought, just at the border of sleep, about his father, about whether Kenji had also trembled at 19, at 20, somewhere in a fog or a field he had never named, whether the trembling had found him too, and whether he had found someone beside him in the dark who said it was all right, who said it was the right thing. He thought about the word his father had given him, about the blade, and what it was for, the softness in a person that must first be cut. And he wondered now, for the first time, whether his father had meant not that the softness should be removed, but that it should be honestly faced, held in the hand without flinching, kept. He slept against the post, in the dark beyond the lanterns, with Run beside him, and the fog did not return. The stars burned on until the sky began, very slowly, to lighten at its eastern edge. All those too many stars doing their patient and indifferent work right up until the point where the morning made them unnecessary, and they faded quietly back into the blue, as they always do, as they have always done. Pause. That is where this night rests. In the dark corner of an encampment without a name, in the space between too many stars and one solid wooden post, in the slow and steady circles of a hand on a back, and a few plain words spoken without ceremony into the dark. The trembling, Ren had said, was the right thing. It was what it meant to still be here. Takashi would carry this alongside his father's word for the rest of his life. The two of them settled together now, like stones in a deep pocket, the axe word and the trembling word, and he would carry them through everything that followed. The larger battles and the larger losses and the long quiet years on the other side of all of it, when the sword came to rest and the garden began to grow. But that is for other nights. Tonight there's only the camp and the stars and the cold post and the hand that did not stop moving and the ordinary, extraordinary mercy of a person who knew to sit down in the dark beside someone and simply stay. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet details settling into the soft dark behind her eyes. There is no hurry here. If you need to, take a slow breath now. Let it go without effort. Let your shoulders sink a little further into the warmth beneath you. The night holds still. Our next story continues in the same hour, the same unhurried dark, the same gentle world just at the edge of sleep. And it asks nothing of you except to listen or to drift, whichever comes first. There is only the sound of this voice and the soft turning of one moment into the next. On the morning of the third day, when the sound of the war drums had been living in Takashi's body for so long that he no longer heard them as sound, but only as a low pressure behind the eyes, a heaviness in the chest that moved with each breath, he noticed, without quite meaning to notice, that Ren was no longer beside him. It was not a sudden thing. No turning, no calling out, no reaching hand, because in a field pressed so close with men, in air made gray in particular with the dust of 10,000 moving feet, losing sight of a single person was as soft and ordinary a thing as losing the moon behind a cloud, and just as difficult to say when exactly it had happened. One moment Ren had been 2 steps to his right, that familiar broad shoulder, that familiar way he carried his head slightly forward when he was moving, as if always leaning just a little toward wherever he was going. And then the line shifted the way lines do, inward and sideways at once. And when the settling came, the space where Ren had been was filled with a stranger, and Ren was simply not there. Takashi kept moving because moving was what the line did, and he was part of the line. The drums had come from somewhere to the east, or perhaps the west. It was genuinely difficult to say, direction having become unreliable since the sun disappeared behind the clouds on the first morning and had not returned, leaving every line of the compass feeling equally distant. And they had not changed their rhythm in 3 days. And somewhere deep inside the space behind his thoughts, Takashi had stopped trying to interpret them and had simply accepted them the way you accept a particular temperature when you have been sitting in a room long enough to stop noticing it. He said Wren's name once into the noise, or he believed he did. It was genuinely hard to know whether the word had left his throat or had only formed there and dissolved. The way a word sometimes does when a thing you need to say is too large to fit comfortably into the small shape a single name provides. Around him, men pressed and moved and fell and were replaced by others. And the afternoon came over the field slowly and without announcement, and the gray light thickened toward evening, and the pressing of bodies thinned gradually into something more like standing, more like exhaustion, more like the particular quiet that comes after a long storm when the storm is not ended, but is simply resting. It was in that late afternoon settling, when the fighting had moved somewhere else and left behind only its evidence, that Takashi turned and began walking toward the rear, because the rear was where you looked when you needed to find someone. The field was not what a field is supposed to be, not anymore. It had been something before all of this, rice, perhaps, or barley, or some other crop with a name and a harvest date that someone had written in an account book in a farmhouse that was probably no longer standing, and beneath the mud you could still sense the old shape of it, the rows and the channels of a working farm, the earth holding its memory of what it had been shaped to do, the way old wood holds the memory of the tree it came from. The surface of it had become something without a clean name. Churned clay and standing water, and the slow, particular collapse that happens to ground that has been walked over by thousands of feet in weather that could not decide between rain and the memory of rain, between a genuine sky and one that simply pretended. He moved through it slowly, because you could not move through such things quickly, and because there was something in the slowness that felt, if not right, then at least honest. He found Wren in the northern corner of what had been the field, near a low embankment where the mud was deepest and water had pooled in the long ruts left by something heavy passing through. A cart, perhaps, or horses, or simply the weight of enough men walking in the same direction over the same soft ground. Wren was face down. That was the first thing Takashi's eyes reported before the rest of him had time to catch up. Not the stillness, not the arrangement of the arms, but simply the face down, which was wrong in a way he recognized immediately and without thinking, because Wren had mentioned once, beside a fire, in the way people say small true things about themselves when the dark makes such things safe to say, that he could never sleep on his front, that it gave him the feeling of being held down by someone, with bad intentions, and he always woke from it more tired than he had started. He had said this with a mild exasperation, as if the inability were a personal failing he had not quite managed to address. And Takashi had laughed, and the memory of that laughter was very clear now, standing here in this mud, very present, the way certain memories rise without being called. Takashi knelt beside Wren and turned him over slowly, with both hands, the way you handle something you're still hoping to be surprised by, and he saw that Wren's mouth was open, half open, the way a mouth is when a word has been started and not yet finished, when the breath is already waiting for the next syllable to arrive. He looked at that open mouth for a long moment, longer than he had looked at almost anything in 3 days, and without willing the thought, it arrived, quiet and complete. Wren had been speaking when he fell, and in all likelihood, Wren had been speaking about his farm, That was almost always what Ren talked about. Given any pause in the noise long enough to fit a few sentences. The 7 children he intended to have. The particular slope of the land he had chosen in his mind. The way water would come down from the north and fill the lower paddies before the upper ones. The dry corner near the house where the soil was better for vegetables. The brown dog he was going to find, which he had specified as brown with such particular certainty that it was easy to believe he had already met the dog somewhere in the bright geography of his own future and was simply describing what he had seen. It was possible, and Takashi found himself sitting with this thought, still kneeling, the cold of the mud coming through his knees, the cold settling into his palms, that Ren had died mid-sentence, mid-word perhaps, still inside the warm and thoroughly described country of a farm that had existed nowhere but in his telling of it, which meant, in the only way that had ever truly mattered, that the farm had been the last place Ren was. Takashi held that thought for a moment, letting it be what it was, and then he began the work of lifting. Ren was heavy, not in the way of a large man. Ren was broad but not tall, solid but not heavy by any ordinary accounting, but with a weight that belonged to a different category altogether, a weight that had nothing to do with size, that Takashi had no prior experience of and would never fully explain to anyone afterward, only ever say, if pressed, heavier than you would think, heavier than anything alive is, heavier than the logs in winter training, heavier than grief, though grief, he would come to understand much later, has its own considerable mass. He understood, in some part of himself that was still capable of understanding such things, that the body releases when it is no longer inhabited the constant small negotiations that make a living person possible to carry, the micro adjustments of weight and balance, the living cooperation that a person performs without knowing they perform it, and what remains is mass without assistance, weight without the part that helps you bear it. Understanding this did not make it lighter. He stood because standing was where carrying begins, and he adjusted Ren's weight across his shoulders, found his footing in the mud, and turned toward wherever the rear of the battle was from here, toward somewhere that was not this particular corner of this particular field. The walk back was long or short, or neither. Time had become genuinely unreliable since the drum started, and he had given up consulting it. The way you stop consulting a clock you have confirmed is wrong. And he moved through the northern edge of the field, through the narrow passage between standing groups of men who had nothing to do in that moment, and were doing it quietly, just standing, watching the space in front of them with the particular expression of men who have been waiting long enough to stop expecting anything. And they looked at Takashi as he passed, at the thing across his shoulders, and none of them spoke, and he was grateful for that in a way that had no name he knew. There was a slope, gentle, barely a slope, more of a long lean in the ground, and Takashi walked up it with each step as its own separate small decision, his legs asking and the rest of him agreeing, step after step, the body knowing how to do what it has been prepared to do even when it has not been prepared to do exactly this. He thought about the farm. He thought about the 7 children who had never existed anywhere but in the warmth of Ren's descriptions of them, who were now in the same place those descriptions were, inside Takashi's memory, in the country of things that persist by being remembered by someone who loved the person who imagined them. He thought about the brown dog who had waited in a bright corner of Wren's imagining and would wait there still, patient, uncollected, the most loyal of all the uncollected things. He was waiting, without quite knowing he was waiting, for something to arrive, for grief in the form he had known before, that had come once in the corner of a camp on a difficult night, that had started small and then arrived completely, a whole thing with a beginning and an end, and Wren sitting beside him without being asked, a hand on his back, warm and steady, no words, until it had finished. Wren had known how to sit with someone in a hard moment, had known, without being told, that what was needed was not an explanation or reassurance, but simply a person staying, the presence of someone choosing not to leave, and he had offered it as naturally as he offered half his rice, which he also did, regularly, without making anything of it afterward, without even seeming to notice he had done it. But now, moving through the gray and failing light with Ron across his shoulders, Takashi looked for what should have been coming and found instead a particular blankness. The way you find a room empty that you had expected to be occupied. Not the absence of feeling. He would want to explain later, many years later, in a garden, to the silence of a plum tree that was just beginning to consider blooming, but feeling of a size that had not yet found its form. The way a river in flood has no clear bank, only the wide reaching of itself in all directions at once, with nowhere particular to go. He looked for tears the way you look for something you have set down in a familiar room and cannot find. It should be here. I know I had it. I've had it before in exactly this kind of room. And it simply was not there. And this absence was its own kind of heaviness, its own thing to carry alongside everything else he was carrying. He reached the rear line as the last of the light was leaving the sky, when men with torches were moving in the dusk and a flat stretch of harder ground had been cleared for those who had been carried back, and Takashi walked to that flat ground and knelt slowly and set Ren down with the same care he had used in lifting him. Both hands, no hurrying, the way you return something you've been trusted with and want to return well. Ren's mouth was still open. Someone came with a cloth, and Takashi took it, and he closed Ren's mouth gently, with his thumb and first finger pressing carefully the way you close a door in a house where someone has already gone to sleep and you do not want to disturb them. He sat beside Ren for a long while after that, not speaking, not quite praying, just present, the way Ren had once been present with him in a dark corner of a camp. No words, a hand on a back, the simple and complete gift of a person choosing to stay when staying was the only useful thing. The torches moved around him, and men came and went with their particular purposes, and somewhere beyond the low hill the drums had stopped. He could not say when exactly, only that their absence was very full, the way silence takes the shape of the sound it follows, the way a room keeps the warmth of a body for some time after the body is gone. The night came in around the edges of the firelight, slowly and without announcement, and Takashi let it come. He found himself, in that sitting, making a kind of quiet inventory, not deliberately, but the way the mind moves when it has been given a moment of stillness, of everything he was still carrying that was not the weight of a body. The single sentence his father had pressed into his hands on a snowy morning long ago. One sentence that had been enough for a whole life. The sound of Wren's laughter, that specific laughter, the kind that started somewhere low in the chest and arrived late, and a little surprised at the face. The way Wren said the word 7 when describing his children, as if 7 were not an ordinary number, but a particular quality of fullness, the exact and correct measure of a life that had been properly considered. All of it was still there. And in the slow and patient way, that understanding comes when you are not pushing toward it. The way a light shifts behind a paper screen without the flame moving at all. He began to understand that the things Run had given him over years of fires and marches and bad weather and shared rice did not leave with Run. That they were laid into Takashi's body now, permanently. The way sound works itself into the wood of an old house and stays long after the instrument has been put away. The farm was still there, too, in the only form it had ever truly had. Not real, not anywhere a person could stand and point to, but still present. The 7 children, the brown dog, the slope from the north, the water coming down in the right order, held now in Takashi's memory instead of Ren's, which was not what either of them would have chosen, but which was not nothing, which was a kind of continuation, a kind of custody, which would simply have to be enough. He stood, eventually, because there were things that needed doing, and he was still capable of doing them, and he moved through the camp doing those things, one after another, the way you move through necessary tasks when moving is all there is, and the alternative is sitting still long enough to feel everything at once. But he carried the weight with him, a weight that had changed its form but not its nature. Not on his shoulders anymore. That part was finished, but somewhere deeper, in that particular place the body stores what it will not put down, what it converts instead into something that simply lives there, the way an old injury lives in a joint, known and familiar and present in all weather. It would be years before he cried. Many years and a different life, and a small child's hand clutching at his sleeve on a cold bridge in the middle of winter, in a garden he had planted himself in ground that had once been as hard and closed as a fist before the grief that had been too large for tears finally found its form. In the middle of an ordinary afternoon, without warning, which is how such things arrive when they have been patient long enough. But that is for another night, another chapter, another lamp going down. For tonight, he walked back through a dark that had finally gone quiet, carrying what he could not put down, moving the way a river moves, not around what remains, but through it, over it, finding a way that is not avoidance, but something older than avoidance, something the body knows without being taught, that you continue, and the continuing is itself a kind of answer to the wait. And somewhere in the wide and unhurried country between one sleeping breath and the next, in the place where things are kept that cannot be carried in the hands, there is still a farm, precisely described, with a slope from the north and a dry corner by the house, and children who are always just about to be born, and one brown dog who is always just arriving. That much Rin kept, and so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows settling back into stillness, the echo of those footsteps growing quieter now, like a tide drawing gently away from shore. There is no hurry. If you need a moment, take one, breathe slowly, Let your shoulders soften against whatever warmth surrounds you. The night is patient. It holds space for you without asking anything in return. And when you're ready, simply let yourself drift a little further, because the same story is continuing, the same night unfolding around the same quiet house. The same hours moving forward in that unhurried way that only the deepest part of night knows how to do. We are still there. We have not gone far at all. Somewhere in the long hours between the last sound of fighting and the slow, gray arrival of morning, Takashi sat beside his lord in the ruins of the encampment. And the fires that had taken the tents were now only glowing embers settling quietly into ash. Lord Daichi lay on the ground not far from the scorch post that had once held his banner, and the banner itself was gone, burned or taken, and its absence made the air feel strangely open. The way a room feels when something large has been removed from it and the space has not yet decided what it is now. The wound across his lord's side was deep, and Takashi had done what he could with cloth torn from his own underrobe, pressing it there with the weight of both hands. But he had known for some time that it was not enough, and that knowing had settled into him like cold water finding its level in stone, quiet and final, and finished arguing with itself. Around them, the camp was mostly quiet now, the way a storm goes quiet not because the danger is past, but because the storm has spent everything it had and there is nothing left to be loud with. Other men moved at the edges of the firelight, slow and uncertain in the way that men move when they have survived something they had not entirely planned for, and their shapes passed at a distance without coming close, as though something in how Takashi was sitting told them to leave this particular corner of the night alone. Daichi's breathing had become shallow and careful, each breath drawn in as though he were listening to it, as though the breath itself were a small surprise that he was glad to receive and did not want to rush past. Takashi had been with this man for more years than he could count quickly, had ridden under his banner through weather that had no good name, had followed the quiet steadiness of his lord's voice through the noise of every field. And now, with all of that behind them, the most he could do was sit on the cold ground and hold his lord's hand and not look away. The smoke was still moving through the air above them, slow and pale against the darkness, carrying the smell of cedar and something sharper that Takashi did not try to name, and it moved the way grief moves, without hurry, finding every corner of the open air and filling it completely before moving on. He had not thought about grief in those terms before, had not found the comparison available to him until just now, sitting in the ruined camp with the embers going out one by one. But once it arrived, the thought stayed, fitting itself quietly into the night the way all true things do. Daichi turned his head a little, not toward the dying fires or toward the sound at the edges of the camp, but toward Takashi, and his eyes, when they found Takashi's face, were still clear, still steady, which had always been the thing about this man that was hardest to prepare yourself for. The steadiness of him, the way it persisted past every occasion that should have ended it. He said something first that Takashi could not quite catch, the words too low and too measured for the distance between them. And Takashi leaned forward until his ear was close, and the hand in his tightened a little, the fingers pressing once, the way a man presses a familiar tool he has used for 30 years and is, at last, gently setting down. Daichi asked him then, in a voice made slow by the weight of the night and the weight of everything else that had been accumulating in this field for 3 days, what Takashi thought the sword was for. It was not the question Takashi had been preparing himself for through all those long hours of sitting and pressing cloth against a wound that would not obey his hands. He had been ready for final instructions, for a name to carry forward, for the kind of measured words a dying lord gives a trusted retainer the way a lamp is passed carefully through a doorway, so the flame does not go out. He had prepared himself for nearly anything, he thought, except the question he was now sitting fully inside, with no answer in reach and the embers going dim one by one around him. Takashi said that he did not know, and the words came out more quietly than he had intended. Almost no voice behind them at all, just the shape of an answer without the substance that was supposed to fill it. And Daichi smiled at that, a small and private smile, the kind that belongs to a man who has just heard the exact answer he had quietly expected, and found something almost like comfort in the confirmation that he had expected correctly. He told Takashi then, speaking with intervals of rest between the sentences, that he himself had not known either, and that this was the thing he had most wanted to say before he ran out of evening to say it in. He had believed for many years, he murmured, that the sword was for the Lord it served, that the meaning of a blade lived entirely in the purpose of the hand that directed it, and that a retainer who asked deeper questions was simply one who had not yet learned to stop at the right boundary. He had held to that belief again when the old world began to change, when alliances that had seemed permanent became renegotiable and the names of lords changed like the names of seasons. And the sword simply went where the hand carried it, and the hand went where the Lord commanded, and the chain of meaning held itself together through sheer habit. But in the long, quiet years between the great campaigns, he recalled softly the particular quiet of a room late at night when the day's decisions had all been made, and there was nothing but the sound of a lamp burning and the slow thought of men who had not come back. The chain had begun to feel less like a fact about the world, and more like a story he had been telling himself for long enough that he had stopped noticing he was the one telling it. He had begun to wonder, Daichi said, with his eyes now closed and his hands still warm in Takashi's hold, whether the sword's meaning was not in what it pointed at, but in what it stood between the person who carried it and whatever would have reached that person if the sword had not been there. But even that, he admitted softly, might only be another way of wearing the same unanswerable question in slightly different clothes, and he had not decided, in the end, and the not deciding had followed him all the way to this ground. There was something in the way he said it, a loosening, a long-held breath finally released. And Takashi could see that the not deciding had stopped feeling like failure sometime recently, had become instead simply a fact about the world, and the relief of that was visible in his lord's face in a way that no victory had ever been. Takashi held his lord's hand and said nothing for a long while, and the fires continued their slow settling, and the smoke continued to move, and the camp around them continued to be the emptied ruin it had become, and the night was very wide and very still. He thought about his father Kenji, who had pressed a hatchet into his hands on a cold, snowy morning and given him one sentence that had lasted a lifetime, a sentence about the blade and what it demanded first from the one who carried it. And he had always taken that sentence as a kind of beginning, the first page of something that would eventually explain itself fully if he only kept going. He thought about Ron, who had died in the mud with his mouth still half open and an entire life still unbegun. The 7 children, the field, the neighboring house, all the rest of it, and whether everything that Ren had been going to do had gone somewhere or had simply stopped the way a lamp stops when you put it out. And he thought about himself, which was something he had not done in a long time, without a task to put between himself and the thinking, and found that he did not have much to say on the subject, which was its own kind of answer about the life he had been living. Daichi's hand grew still some time before the sky began to lighten, and Takashi sat for a while longer with it, not ready yet to let the stillness become official by moving away from it. The moment of a great man's death, he found himself thinking, is a smaller thing than you expect, smaller and quieter, like the last note of a song you've been listening to for years, which is just a note, and then nothing, and then the particular quality of the silence that follows, which is full of the song even though the song is gone. He stayed until the first pale suggestion of dawn began along the far edge of the sky, that slow, undecided light that is not yet morning, but has stopped being night. And then he gently returned his lord's hand to the ground and straightened up and looked at what remained of the camp around him. There was not much. The great banner was gone, and the tent poles stood at angles that made them look uncertain of their purpose, and the ground between them was dark with ash and the remnants of everything a campaign carries to feed itself through a long season. And the few men who remained moved carefully, like people who are not sure the ground is solid beneath them and are not yet ready to test it with their full weight. He picked up his sword from where it had lain beside him through the night and put it back at his side, and the familiar weight of it felt strange now in a way it had never quite been strange before, like a word said so many times in a row that it stops sounding like a word and becomes instead simply a sound, still present, still making the air move, but detached from whatever it had been supposed to mean. He walked out of the encampment as the dawn came properly, stepping over the remains of fires, past a broken cart that someone had dragged partly out of the way and then left in the middle of its own dragging, out through the gap in the camp perimeter where the stakes had been pulled and not replaced, and then out onto the field beyond. The field was open and very flat, the kind of flat that seems like the land itself is holding its breath, and the early light came sideways across it in the way autumn morning light does, making every blade of dry grass throw a shadow longer than itself, each one pointing away from the sun in its own direction. He did not have a direction of his own. This was an old feeling that had been kept at a careful distance for many years and was now present again without anything to hold it back. The feeling of no direction given, no command, no campaign with its own forward momentum carrying him, and the openness of it was both larger and quieter than he had remembered it being. For as long as he could remember, direction had come from somewhere outside him, from his father first, and then from the demands of training, and then from the word of the Lord. And before he knew it, the habit of receiving direction from outside had become so complete that he had stopped noticing he was doing it, the way you stop noticing any habit that has been running underneath your days for long enough. Now the current had stopped, or he had stepped out of it, or both things had happened at once somewhere back in the burning camp. And he was standing in the autumn field with no current to follow, and the question still sitting in his chest exactly as Daichi had placed it there, patient and unhurried and entirely intact. What the sword was for, and the question did not feel, standing there in the flat morning light, like a question only about swords. It felt like a question about what any capability is finally for. The hatchet his father had pressed into his hands on the snowy morning, the blade that had come after, the whole long life of being useful in a particular and specific way, and whether that usefulness had a direction running beyond itself towards something it was serving, or whether the usefulness had always simply been the end, and he had never stopped long enough to notice that either. He walked, because walking was something the body could do without being told, carrying the question forward through the dry grass, and the morning even when the mind had nothing useful to offer by way of guidance. The field gave way to a path edged in tall grass that hissed softly when the wind moved through it, and the path gave way to a road with old ruts from cart wheels. And he followed the road without knowing where it led, which seemed, in the present circumstances, a reasonable enough way to be in the world. The question came and went as he walked, in the way a stone in a pocket comes and goes, not constant, but the hand finds it again without choosing to. And there it is, still smooth, still the same shape, still as fully unanswered as when it was first put there. He was a masterless man now, which was a condition with a word for it, a wave man, a ronin, named after the thing he had been taken from rather than the thing he was, as though the wave were the identity and the man moving through it a secondary consideration. He turned the word over as he walked and found it neither disaster nor freedom yet, just a fact that had not yet decided what it wanted to become, which seemed appropriate given that it was sharing the road with a question that had not decided anything either. Around midday, he came to a stream crossing the road and knelt beside it and put his hands in the cold water and drank, and then stayed there for a while with his wet hands resting on his thighs, watching the way the water moved over the stones, over and around them, finding whatever path was available. Not because it had chosen the path, but because the path was what the water and the stones had made together over years of each simply being what they were. His Lord Daichi was behind him now in the world, back at the ruined camp that would by now be attended to by whoever remained to attend to it, the dead collected and the living accounted for, and the whole ended campaign beginning its slow transformation into a named historical thing with settled edges and a summarized meaning. But the question Daichi had asked in the dark would not become a settled thing with edges. He was already certain of that with the particular certainty you have about things that are simply too large and too old to ever stop being questions, no matter how many years you spend in their company. Later in the afternoon, he came to a village, one of those small places that had grown up along a road the way they do, without anyone deciding to build a village. And there was a well in the center and a woman drawing water who looked at him with the measured sideways attention of someone long practiced at assessing armed strangers without making the assessment obvious. He exchanged 3 coins for a corner of a room and a bowl of warm rice, and ate it slowly, in the way you eat when you have not eaten in longer than you have been keeping track. the warmth moving through him the way warmth moves through cold stone, slowly, thoroughly, reaching places that have been cold for a long time. Nobody in the village asked him about the battle, though they must have known smoke travels and news travels faster, and he was grateful for the ordinary life of the place going on around him. The chickens crossing the yard, the old man at the doorway watching the afternoon settle, the children running without looking at him because he was simply a man passing through. And that was enough, and more than enough. That night he lay in the borrowed corner on the borrowed mat and looked at the ceiling, and the question was still there, exactly as Daichi had left it, undiminished by the miles of road between here and the burning camp, patient as ever. He found himself thinking about his Lord's face in those final hours, the steadiness that had always seemed from the outside like certainty, and he understood now, with the distance of a day and a bowl of rice between himself and the moment, that it had never been certainty at all, had always been something closer to a long and practiced refusal to let uncertainty become chaos, which is a different thing, quieter and more demanding and perhaps more admirable. A man could be steady without being sure, he thought, could walk forward without knowing where the walking ended, could carry a sword his whole life without ever arriving at a final answer about what the sword was for, and hold the not knowing the way you hold anything important with both hands without setting it down, even when tired. He supposed that was what his father Kenji had been passing forward on the snowy morning, the hatchet pressed in his small hands and one sentence that had lasted a lifetime. Not an answer, but a stance, a way of meeting each morning without softness and without theater, which is itself a kind of answer to the question, even if it does not claim to be. Outside, the village had gone quiet, and the quiet came in through the walls the way rural quiet does, carrying the sound of insects and the distant sound of water moving over stones somewhere in the dark, and it was very soft against the edges of the night. And somewhere in that softness, with the ceiling above him and the road ahead of him and the ruined camp behind him and the question lying in the dark among all three, Takashi found that the question had agreed, at least for now, to rest. Not answered, not gone, but still, in the way that all unanswered things go still when the night is deep enough and the body has been tired long enough. He had no lord, no direction, no answer to carry forward, and yet the borrowed mat was warm, and the room was quiet, and somewhere outside a night bird called once and did not call again, and the dark held everything it held, gently, without asking anything in return. And that, for this particular night, was where the road rested, not at an answer, but at the first true moment of understanding the shape of the question itself, on a borrowed mat in a village with no name, with the sword at his side, and the long road still ahead, and the morning waiting, patient as water, to be walked into one step at a time. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet details settling gently into the dark behind us. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one. Let your breath come slow and easy. Let your shoulders soften just a little more into whatever is holding you. The night is patient, and so are we. Our next story is not far away at all. It is the same night continuing, the same stillness unfolding, only now in a different room, a different life, though the quiet feels just as familiar. So rest here for just a breath or two, and when you are ready, we will simply drift forward together. In a small rented room at the edge of a castle town, in the 39th year of his life, Takashi sat alone with a sword he no longer needed and a cup of sake he no longer knew how to refuse. The lamp was burning low, and the paper screen held the blue-white stillness of a winter evening outside, and the abacus on the low table had been pushed to one side, its beads in the same approximate disorder they had been in since the afternoon. His sword leaned against the far wall where he had rested it some weeks ago, and if he looked carefully, which he did most evenings for lack of anything useful to look at, he could see where the rust had begun its quiet work along the collar of the scabbard, a thin, discolored line doing what rust does when a blade is left alone, patient and unhurried, asking nothing. The world had changed was the thing, not suddenly. Nothing that large changes suddenly, but in the slow way of enormous things, which is the accumulation of many unremarkable moments, until one morning you look up and the horizon is entirely different from the one you learned as a child. In the East, a great lord had settled his authority over the land the way snow settles, without declaration or drama, simply descending until everything beneath it took the shape the new order required. And the shape the new order required was very different from what had come before. They were calling it the Age of Peace, and Takashi had heard those words so many times in recent months that they had worn smooth in his mind, the syllables going past him now like water over stone. The Age of Peace, the Age of Peace, and nothing stirring in him at the sound of them, nothing answering. In the great hall down the road, men who had once commanded squadrons now sat before their abacuses with the concentrated frown of men learning something they suspected they should have known all along, their broad hands moving carefully between the beads, adding and subtracting with the slow, deliberate care of men whose hands have been trained for quite different work. There were scribes now in rooms that had once been armories, and the corridors of the castle carried the low murmur of ledger work, the steady scratch of brush on paper, the occasional polite exchange of administrative questions, the whole building engaged in a new and particular kind of war in which Takashi had no training and no natural aptitude. He had been assigned a desk in one of those rooms and a set of accounts to manage, and the junior steward who explained the system to him had done so with the uncomfortable brightness of a man whose task was to make something simple sound even simpler than it was, and who could see perfectly well that it was not going to work. He had tried to be fair to himself. For 2 weeks, he had opened the ledger each morning with the same deliberate attention he had once given to reading an opponent, the set of their shoulders, the way they placed their weight, the particular tilt of a blade before commitment, and found that numbers, unlike men, offered no readable intention, no body to observe, no hesitation that told you what was coming. By midday, his head ached in a way that no battle had ever managed to produce, a dense and humiliating ache just behind his eyes that reminded him, each time it arrived, of exactly the kind of man he was not and had never been and perhaps could not at 39 become. The other men in the room appeared to manage the accounts without visible difficulty. and Takashi had spent considerable time studying them the way he used to study terrain, trying to identify what quiet intelligence they were bringing to bear that he lacked, what pattern of thought they possessed that he did not. They were not clever, he had eventually decided, or not only clever. It was that they had been made for this all along, their shapes fitting the piece the way a hand fits a familiar tool, while he was a shape cut out for something else entirely, and no amount of turning or pressing could make him fit a space his outline had not been made for. So he had stopped going. Not all at once, because such surrenders rarely arrive as decisions. They accumulate instead. An afternoon left a little early. A morning arrived a little late. A day skipped with a private justification that was not quite a lie and not quite the truth, until the days had simplified themselves into the form they apparently wanted to take. The rented room, the lamp, the sake, the sword gathering its rust against the wall. He told himself he was not a man who drank out of grief or self-pity or the particular formless despair that seemed to settle over some men in peacetime like a mist that never quite lifted. He drank because the evenings were long and the sake was warm, and because after the second cup and into the third, a certain muffled quality descended over his thoughts. Not happiness, he was not foolish enough to call it that, but at least the absence of the sharper thing, the specific misery of a man who has only one skill and has been placed by history in a world where that skill is no longer of any use to anyone. He thought of Run in those evenings, more than he might have wished to. Run, who had laughed at almost everything and who had crouched beside a fire one cold night, many years before, and spoken quietly of the farm he intended to cultivate when the fighting ended. 7 children, he had said, in the certain tone of a man who does not regard such things as aspirational. A neighboring plot for Takashi. Mornings of unremarkable labor. The slow, satisfying weight of a life that accumulates rather than burns. Ren had spoken of all of this as though it were simply a matter of getting through the present difficulty, as though the future were a room they were walking toward and had only to reach, and Takashi had listened and believed it alongside him because Ren's certainty was the kind that you borrowed without quite meaning to, that settled into your chest and felt like your own. Ren had not seen the peace. Ren had remained in that field where Takashi had found him at the end of the 3rd day, still half open in the middle of some sentence about the farm. The mud patient around in the way mud is always patient, while the battle moved on without him into the middle distance, and left everything he had intended to do undone. There were evenings when Takashi caught himself thinking something he knew to be a small and terrible thought, that Ren had been spared the long, strange difficulty of surviving into a world that did not need you, that dying before the peace arrived was a kind of grace, and he would let the thought sit there in the lamplight without chasing it away, the sake making it possible to look at such things without flinching. He was not proud of the thought, and he knew it could not survive much scrutiny, and in the mornings it dissolved the way such thoughts do, back into the more decent grief of simply missing a man whose laugh had made the hard years bearable. But in those particular evenings, with the lamp burning low and the sake at hand, scrutiny was not something he could always arrange. And so he would let the thought arrive, and sit, and go, and pour the next cup, and listen to the town outside the paper screen settling into its evening quiet. Outside, the castle town arranged itself in its winter routines, the distant sound of a household at its last work of the day, a child's voice briefly audible and then absorbed back into the general quiet. The particular compressed silence of close-built walls on a cold night, which is different from country silence, fuller somehow, as if the quiet itself has weight and the walls are holding it in. Takashi listened to all of it from behind his paper screen and felt himself at a remove from it. Not the remove of a man who dislikes the peace, but of a man who cannot locate himself within it, who cannot find his own shape in the new arrangement of the world, no matter how carefully he looks. He was 39 years old and had spent the better part of his life learning how to fight and the remaining years fighting. And now the fighting was over, and what remained was this specific ordinary evening, the lamp and the sake and the sword against the wall, and the question that had been with him since before the peace, since before the last battle, since long before any of it, of what any of it had been for. His father Kenji had offered, once the clearest answer Takashi had ever been given, had offered it on a cold gray morning at the woodpile, the breath visible in the air between them, the hand closing around his son's smaller one and bringing it to the axe handle with a patience that was not instructing but simply showing, and then the words arriving low and level and warm the way the fire inside was warm. A blade, Kenji had told him, was not primarily for enemies. A blade's first use was for the weakness in the man who held it, the self-indulgence, the retreating thing that would always rather not, the comfortable pull toward ease and warmth, and remaining seated when the work required standing. And what a man's discipline amounted to was nothing more or less than the daily practice of cutting that retreat before it could take hold. Takashi had kept that instruction close for 30 years, had used it through exhaustion and cold and the particular despair of the night before a battle one has little reason to expect to survive, had used it the way a man uses a compass in unfamiliar country, not fully understanding it, simply trusting the direction it pointed and walking that way. Now he held a sake cup, and the compass had stopped pointing anywhere he could follow. The self-indulgence, he thought, and looked at the cup. These evenings accumulating. The abacus pushed aside with its beads in their useless disorder. The rust on the collar of the scabbard that he could see from where he sat and that he had not addressed, and each day of not addressing it made the next day of not addressing it slightly easier, which was precisely how the small surrenders worked, each one smoothing the path of the next, the whole arrangement settling over time into a habit so established that it no longer felt like a choice at all, simply the shape of the day. He had known other men from his old unit who had not managed the peace well. One who had turned to gambling with the intense focus of a man trained for risk who could not tolerate its absence, finding in the card game the approximate pressure he had been made for. Another who had grown quarrelsome in the particular restless way of men whose edge has no purpose and therefore turns inward or sideways, looking for the friction it was built to meet. And himself here in this rented room, adding each empty evening to the account of empty evenings, the lamp patient beside him, the sword patient against the wall, his father's compass in his hand, and the needle going nowhere. His Lord Daichi had asked it in the last minutes of his life The question arriving with the genuine puzzlement of a man who had spent everything answering it with his body and had reached the very end still uncertain. What is a sword for, after all, when everything is said and done and the fires have gone out? Takashi had not been able to answer it then, standing in the burning ruin of that last camp, and the peace had not answered it for him in the months since, had only made the question louder somehow. This asking about a thing whose purpose had been obvious enough when it was in use, and which grew increasingly strange the longer it sat on a wall without one. The blade leaned against the plaster and gathered its rust, and Takashi sat before it the way a man sits before a problem he cannot solve and has not yet given up on entirely, which is a particular kind of sitting, quiet and stubborn, that does not look like much from the outside. Somewhere in the lane outside, a door opened and then closed, the cold briefly entering the audible world and then withdrawing, and a woman's voice spoke to a child in the ordinary patient tone of an evening winding toward its end, a voice tired and present at once, speaking of something small and immediate, a meal, perhaps, or a quilt, the simple, insistent logistics of a life arranged around small needs. He listened to the shape of it until it faded back into the general quiet of the town, unable to make out the words, finding the tone itself sufficient. The warmth in it, the dailiness, the particular texture of a life that accumulates in small increments rather than in the sudden, decisive bursts that war had trained him to exist within. There had been, he supposed, some other version of himself that might have had evenings like that. A household, a courtyard, someone for whom to speak in that patient, tired, loving tone at the end of a day, full of ordinary requirements. He had not found it, or not looked in the right direction at the right moment. The campaigns always arriving at the pivots where such a life might have begun to form, and by the time the fighting ended, he was the age he was now, sitting in a rented room, watching the life he might have had through someone else's paper screen. The lamp guttered once, without reason, and found its footing again. Takashi watched it settle. Outside, without announcement, snow had begun to fall. He could tell by the particular way the silence changed, the way sound softens when snow is moving through the air above a town, as though the world were turning down its own volume one careful notch at a time, the sharp edges of the night gone round and soft. He sat with the cup between his hands and let himself be still. Tomorrow, he thought, and the thought arrived with the worn patience of something he had offered himself many times before, a small recurring hope that was honest in its smallness, not quite believing in itself, but offering itself anyway, because what else was there to do at the end of a long evening but make some small promise to the morning? Tomorrow he would take the claw from his pack and clean the sword, not because the world had any use for it, but because a thing that had served a man well deserved to be kept clean, because the discipline of maintenance was itself a kind of answer to his father's instruction, even if the blade never left the wall again. Tomorrow he would return to the desk in the ledger room and sit with the abacus with less pride about how quickly he was learning and more patience with the slow, late way of coming to something you were not made for, because there was no dignity in refusing a lesson simply because it had arrived at the wrong time of life. Tomorrow he would remember what his father had actually meant, not that the blade was for killing, not even specifically for enemies, but that the practice of cutting the comfortable retreat was the whole point, the discipline entire, and a man without war could still carry that practice the way a lamp carries its flame, regardless of whether the road it is lighting is a battlefield or a very ordinary corridor of a castle town in an age of ledgers and abacuses and peace. He set the sake cup down on the low table with a small, deliberate motion and left it there and watched it sit in the lamplight like any ordinary object in any ordinary room. The flame held. The snow continued outside, softening the edges of the castle town, covering the worn-down surfaces of the day, and making everything briefly, uselessly, beautifully new, which was the one thing snow reliably did, in its indifferent way, not caring whether the things beneath it needed renewal or not, simply falling and covering and making the world quiet. Takashi sat with his father's words moving through him slowly, the way something taken in long ago moves through a man when the body has finally decided to absorb it. Old words, worn smooth, patient and still, after everything, pointing somewhere. He did not know tonight, with any clarity, exactly where they pointed. He only knew that the question was still alive in him. Daichi's question from the burning camp, his father's compass from the cold morning at the woodpile, the long unanswered asking of what a blade was for, what a man was for, when the world no longer needed the particular shape he had been shaped into, and that a question still alive in a man was something, at least. It was not nothing. The snow fell in its own time outside, each flake finding its particular descent through the cold air above the castle town. Unhurried, not trying, simply following the nature of snow, which is to fall and to cover and to make the world quiet. Somewhere in the town a lamp was put out, and then another, the darkness thickening gently in the way darkness does when a place is finished with its day, and the night moved on in its accustomed way toward morning. And Takashi, in the small circle of his own lamp's light, with his untouched cup and his rusting sword and his father's words still moving through him like a slow, steady current he could not redirect, and had stopped trying to let the thought of tomorrow rest where it had landed, and did not press it for more than it could give, and breathed, and was still. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet shadows folding closed like the pages of an old letter tucked away for another day. There is no hurry here. The same night is still unfolding around you, soft and unhurried. The same darkness holding you in place. If you feel yourself drifting, let it happen. Take one slow breath, and then another, and feel the weight of the day settling further into the mattress beneath you. Our next story is already waiting, patient as candlelight, a continuation of that same still evening, reaching gently toward you now. On a morning when the snow had fallen so quietly in the night that no one in the village had heard it arrive, a man named Takashi walked out toward the old wooden bridge at the edge of the rice fields, carrying 2 rice balls wrapped in a cloth the color of old leaves. He was not a young man anymore, and his steps through the snow were careful and unhurried, the way a man walks when he has long since stopped pretending that he has somewhere important to be. The bridge was nothing remarkable, low planks over a narrow stream that froze at the edges in winter and ran muddy in spring, and Takashi had walked past it 100 times or more without once thinking to look down at what lay beneath. But yesterday he had looked down, and in the hollow under the near bank, where the snow sloped away from the stone and left a small dry shadow of earth, he had seen a child. She had been sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, wearing a padded jacket that was too thin for the cold and far too wide for her shoulders, and she had looked up at him with the perfect stillness of a small animal that has learned, through some hard teaching, that moving tends to draw attention. He had stood there on the bridge for a moment, looking down at her, and she had looked up at him, and then he had turned and walked on without speaking because he did not know what to say, and because saying nothing seemed, in that moment, the least harmful thing a man in his position could do. The village had told him, as villages always tell the things that are too large for anyone to carry alone, more than he had thought to ask. She was the daughter of a man from the losing side of the old war, a soldier who had held a spear for the wrong lord on the wrong morning, and who had paid for it in the way that men paid for such things in those years. And she had no mother left, no uncle, no older cousin, no one in this village or any other who had put food in front of her in some time. The villagers said this the way people say things that are true and also impossible, with a small shrug of the shoulders that means we see it and we cannot fix it. And what would you have us do? And then they moved on to other things because life moves on whether you are finished with it or not. Takashi had not moved on. He had gone home in the early dark of the winter afternoon, lit his lamp, and sat at his low table with his hands resting on his knees and his back straight, the way a man sits when he is trying to think clearly about something he would rather not think about at all. The question was not whether he could help her. That part, when he held it plainly in the light of the lamp, was simple enough. One man with a house and a rice pot and a dry floor. One child with nothing. The question that kept him sitting there past the hour when he would normally have slept was older than that, and had more edges to it. It had to do with the flag her father had carried, and the field where Takashi had fought, and the men who had gone into the mud of that field and had not come back out. He had been on one side of that line, and her father had been on the other. And somewhere in the arithmetic of war, the lightless, graceless arithmetic that no one who has lived through a war enjoys looking at clearly, it was possible, more than possible, that he had faced her father. That the hands that had shaped rice this morning were the same hands that had, years ago, in a world that felt as far away as another life and as close as yesterday, done what soldiers do in field with names that no one remembers. He sat with that for a long time. The lamp burned lower, and he did not reach to trim it, and the shadows grew longer around him while he stayed very still and let the thoughts settle the way snow settles, slowly, without argument, covering everything equally. He had not chosen the war any more than she had. Her father had not chosen which army had claimed his village any more than Takashi had chosen where he was born, and which lord had needed soldiers, and which valley had needed taking. These things were true, and he held them in the light of the lamp and turned them over, and they did not make the arithmetic any cleaner. They did not erase what was done or give back what was taken. But they were true, and truth has its own kind of weight. What was also true, and this was the part that kept him awake past the hour when the village had gone fully silent, and the only sound was the small settling creak of the house in the cold. Was that she was hungry, and it was winter, and under that bridge she had a jacket that was not hers and nothing else. He fell asleep sometime before the bird started, sitting up at his table, and woke with his neck aching and the lamp guttered out and the room filled with the gray early light that heavy snow makes when it lies thick on the ground and give the light back softly. He sat for a moment with his eyes half open, listening to the silence, and then he rose and went to the rice pot and began. There is something particular about making food for a person you do not know in a quiet room, in the early morning, when the decision is still unspoken and feels as though it might still be undone if you think about it too long. His hands moved through the familiar motions, the damp cloth spread on the board, the warmth of the rice against his palm, the cup pressure that shapes the grains and binds them. And he noticed the way you notice things in quiet mornings when the mind has not yet filled itself with plans and obligations, that this was the same motion and also entirely different. When he was a young soldier, he had made rice balls in the dark before a march, eating them cold on the road before the light came up, thinking of nothing but the distance ahead. He shaped the rice now in the same cold, early light, thinking of a child under a bridge. He wrapped them in the cloth the color of old leaves, tucked the bundle under his arm, and walked out into the snow. The fields lay very white and very still, and his footprints were the first marks in the new surface, and the cold had the dry, clean quality of winter mornings that have not yet been touched by wind, a cold that does not chase you, but simply presents itself, as though to say that this is the temperature now, and you may come or stay as you choose. When he came to the bridge, he stopped on the bank and looked down before stepping onto the planks. She was there. She had drawn herself further back onto the far side of the bridge than she had been the day before, deeper into the shadow of the overhang, and she was watching him with that same absolute stillness, her face pale and serious, her dark eyes doing all the moving that the rest of her was refusing to do. He did not go down to her level, because closing that distance might have seemed like the wrong kind of intention, and he understood, without quite knowing how he understood it, that she was making her own calculations about him and about what was safe, and those calculations deserved the time they needed. He bent at the bank, placed the wrap cloth on a stone near the edge of the overhang, close enough for her to reach without coming fully out into the open, stood back up, straightened his coat, and walked away. He did not look back. The not looking back was harder than he had expected. He thought about it all the way home. The specific discipline of keeping his face forward and his steps even when something behind you asked to be checked on. And he supposed that this was something he and his old friend Rin would have disagreed about entirely. Rin looked back. Rin would have waved, probably, and smiled, and perhaps called something encouraging across the snow, because Rin had never been troubled by the worry that warmth might be too much, that a gesture might be more than a person was ready to receive. But Rin had died in a field with no name, still talking about the farm he would never have, and Takashi was here, doing what Takashi knew how to do, leaving space where space was needed and trusting that space itself was a kind of offer. That night he sat in his room and thought about the cloth. He had left it with the food without thinking, and now he wondered if she would know to keep it against the cold, or if she had already pressed it around her shoulders like a small additional layer. And he found that the wondering was, in its own way, a relief, because worrying about a cloth is a much smaller thing to carry through the dark hours than everything else he had been carrying. He sat with the lamp casting its soft, unsteady light on the table, and found that sitting with the small worry of whether she was warm enough was a different thing entirely from sitting with the large, heavy questions of the night before. The large questions did not go away, but they made room, the way rooms make room when something living enters them. The second morning arrived with less snow, but more wind, and Takashi walked the path to the bridge with his collar pulled close, carrying the same wrap cloth. She had folded it neatly and left it on the stone. He discovered when he arrived, the edges pressed together with some care. The folded cloth stayed with him. She had been cold enough to take the food and hungry enough that she had eaten it, and then she had folded the cloth and left it on the stone, and there was something in that small act, the neatness of it, the returning of a borrowed thing, that told him more about who she was than anything the village had thought to mention. He set down fresh rice balls beside the folded cloth and stood for a moment in the wind and did not look at her directly, but let his eyes rest on the stream instead, the dark water running smooth and cold in the center channel while the edges had gone to ice, pale and faintly luminous in the low light. She had moved a little closer to the edge of the overhang than yesterday. Not much, a hand's width, perhaps, the small adjustment of someone who has revised their estimate of a danger downward by one notch and allowed their body to quietly know it. He noticed and said nothing and turned and walked home through the wind. On the third day, the snow came back heavier. It had begun in the night and was still falling when he woke, steady and thick, the kind of snowfall that means to accumulate and takes its time about it. And the path to the bridge was difficult walking, his feet breaking through a thin crust with each step in that soft, effortful way that turns a short distance into a long one. He did not mind the difficulty. His feet had learned the way by now, and the path required enough attention to keep the mind quiet and present in the body. The particular mercy of winter walking that it asks for your legs and your balance and does not leave much room for the things you would prefer not to think about. She was there, in the shadow under the bridge, and the cloth from the day before was folded on the stone again, and he could see through the falling snow and the low gray light that she had moved closer still to the edge of the overhang. He placed the rice balls on the stone, and then, on this third morning, instead of immediately turning to go, he stood for a while and looked at the stream. He was not trying to appear patient, not performing harmlessness. Those are performances, and he had been too old for performances for a long time. He was simply standing in the cold beside a stream he had lived near for years without ever learning to look at, watching the water move under and around the ice, and finding it worth watching. The ice at the edges had the quality of old glass, slightly opaque, faintly greenish, and where the current ran beneath it, you could see the dark water moving through, quick and purposeful, as though it knew where it was going and had long ago made its peace with the cold above. He stood there for some time. Then he turned and walked back home through the falling snow, and the footprints filled in behind him before he had gone very far. The fourth morning was different in the way that some mornings are different before anything at all has happened. The light a degree cleaner than expected, the cold less urgent, the sky between the clouds holding a small portion of pale winter blue that suggested the snow had finished what it needed to say and was now willing to let the day go on without further comment. Takashi walked the familiar path in this cleaner light, carrying the wrapped cloth, and his legs knew the way well enough that his mind could go where it wanted, and it went, as it often did on these morning walks, to his father. Kenji, who had limped from the old wound in his leg and spoken only when he had something worth saying, which was not often and therefore mattered when it happened. Kenji, who had put the axe handle into his young son's hands on a cold morning in the snow and told him that the blade is for cutting and that the one who carries it must first cut his own softness. He had died before Takashi could ask him which softness. The softness of fear or the softness of kindness, or the softness of wanting to be done with the whole difficult business of being a person who causes and suffers harm in equal measure. He had been trying to answer that question across 40 years and 2 wars and more road than he could remember walking. He came to the bridge and he looked down and she was there. She was sitting differently than she had on any of the other mornings. Knees not quite so tightly held, shoulders not quite so drawn in, and she was not in the deepest shadow anymore, but closer to the edge of the overhang, where the pale light from the open snow touched her, and he could see her face more clearly than he had on any of the other mornings. She was very thin, with dark eyes that held the careful expression of someone who has learned to think several moves ahead of every situation, and her hair had come loose from whatever had bound it and lay softly across the collar of the oversized jacket. He bent and set the rice balls on the stone. He straightened, and he was about to do what he had done on each of the other mornings, turn and begin the walk home, and let the morning be what it was, when he felt something close around his sleeve. It was a small hand. 2 small hands, in fact, closing around the fabric of his sleeve with the particular combination of hesitation and certainty that children have, as though the decision had already been made and was now simply being carried out, and the carrying out was careful, but was not going to stop. He went very still, not from surprise, though there was something that might have been surprise moving quietly through him, but from the instinct of a man who has learned that stillness is often the right response when something small and fragile has decided to trust you, and any sudden motion might undo the whole careful thing. He stood without moving, and she held his sleeve, and the cold morning air settled around them, and the stream went on under the ice, making its soft, continuous sound. Then, slowly he looked down. She was looking up at him. Her face was serious in the way a child's face is serious when it has made a decision that cost everything it had. No smile, no softness, just the clear and direct look of someone who has weighed the thing and done it and is now waiting very steadily to see what comes next. She held his sleeve in both hands, not pulling, simply holding the way you hold something you have decided belongs to you. He found himself thinking later that he had spent the better part of his life believing the heaviest things a man could carry were swords and debts and the memory of men who had gone into the mud and not come back. And here was a child's grip on a piece of cloth that weighed more than any of them. He did not speak. There was nothing he could have said that would not have been smaller than the moment. And he had learned somewhere along the long road of his life that silence is not always the failure of words. Sometimes it is the only response that does not reduce what is happening to something that can fit inside a sentence. He crouched down slowly so that he was at her level, and he looked at her, and she held his sleeve and looked back, and the snow lay still around the bridge, and the pale blue winter light came down through the bare willow branches overhead. Her name was Hannah. The village had told him, and that name arrived in him now, settling into the right place the way a name settles when you have finally met the person who holds it. He reached out one hand, slowly and carefully, the way you move near something that has taken this long to let you close, and he placed it very gently on the top of her head. She did not pull away. She leaned into it, the smallest fraction, not a choice exactly, more the body's own quiet answer to warmth, going toward it the way all cold things go toward warmth when it is finally offered and the fear of it has had time to settle. He thought, then, of Run, of Ren's 7 children who had never been born, and the field that had never been farmed, and the laugh that had rung out in firelit camps, and then gone quiet in the mud of a valley with no name. He thought of Lord Daichi, who had asked in the burning camp what a sword was for, and died before either of them could find the answer, leaving the question to wander through the years looking for somewhere to land. He thought of his father, Kenji, and the blade, and the softness the blade was supposed to cut. And crouching here in the snow, with a child's hands on his sleeve and his own hand resting on the crown of her head, he found himself thinking, not in words, because he was not a man who thought well in words when something real was in front of him, but in the way the body knows things before the mind catches up, that some questions do not get answered so much as outgrown. Not solved, but quietly left behind when the next thing comes along that needs your hands and your attention and your willingness to be still. The snow on the bridge was very white. The stream moved under the ice with a sound like breathing, soft and continuous and without particular intention. The pale winter sky between the clouds offered its quiet blue without asking anything in return. Hannah held his sleeve, and in that stillness, in that small, cold, unhurried morning at the edge of the rice fields, something that had been moving in Takashi for a very long time came, at last, to rest. He did not try to name what it was. He simply stayed where he was, crouched in the snow beside her, for a while longer than was strictly necessary, and then he lifted the rice balls from the stone and held one out toward her, and she took it in her free hand, the other still holding his sleeve, the way she had decided it would, and he waited while she ate, and the morning went on around them the way mornings go, without asking permission, without hurrying. Later, he would carry her home on his back through the snow, because her shoes were too thin and her feet were cold, and she was lighter than he had imagined a person could be, and still contained so much, lighter than all the things he had carried before her, and warmer somehow, in a way that living things are warm even in the cold, even after everything. But that was still a little ahead, and they had not gotten there yet. For now there was just the cold and the still air, and the rice in her hands, and the bridge, and the stream running softly beneath the ice, and the pale blue of the winter sky, giving everything it had to the morning. And that perhaps, is where we will leave them tonight. Not at an ending, but at a beginning, the kind that does not announce itself, that arrives quietly in the shape of a small hand on an old soldier's sleeve on a cold morning in the snow. Rest now. The stream is still moving somewhere under the ice, and the morning is very soft, and there is nothing more that needs to happen tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet settling into the dark like dust returning to rest. There is no need to hold any of it. The words, the faces, the feeling that was there. Simply let it dissolve at the edges, the way a dream does when morning is still very far away. Take a slow breath now, if you like. There is no hurry here. The same night continues to unfold around you, soft and unhurried, and our next story waits in that same gentle dark, patient as the hour itself, ready to carry you a little further into stillness. In a small room at the back of an aging house, set against the far end of a valley where the snow came early and the mornings arrived still wrapped in river mist, an old man named Takashi sat at a low writing table with a brush in his hand and a length of paper smoothed out before him. And for a long while he did not write a single word. He was old now, genuinely old, the kind of old that announces itself in the set of the shoulders and the particular careful way a person moves through a doorway, and the trembling in his hands had become something he simply lived alongside, the way one lives alongside a creek near the house, noticing it, not troubled by it. The room smelled of cedar and ink and the faint green smell of the garden that came in through the paper screen when the night air moved. And through that same screen the garden was visible as a dim and sleeping thing, all soft outlines and winter silence. He had been meaning to write this letter for years, not because the words had been unavailable to him, but because there is a particular kind of letter that you cannot begin until you understand what you are saying, and understanding had come slowly to Takashi, as most essential things had come to him, late and without announcement. He had understood it fully, he thought, on the evening that Hannah was married, when he had stood at the edge of this same garden in his good robe, watching the lanterns move in the hands of the wedding guests, listening to the young laughter rising and falling in the still air, and had felt, with a clarity that arrived quietly, the way a season arrives, that his particular chapter of the world was nearly finished. Not the long chapter of the sword, the one that had begun with a boy gripping an axe in a snowy morning and his father Kenji's voice low beside him, and that had run through decades of war and road and loss. He meant the other chapter, the shorter and better one, the one that had begun on a bridge over a cold river on a morning when he had carried 2 rice balls wrapped in cloth and had no idea what he was walking toward. He had stood on that bridge for a while before going down beneath it, into the shadow where the stones met the frozen water, and he had found her there just as someone in the village had told him she would be. A small girl, perhaps 9 years old, sitting very still with her knees drawn up under her thin coat, watching him with the careful and measuring eyes of a child who has learned not to make sudden movements. He had known who she was, or had suspected. He knew the name of the Lord who had held the territory on the other side of the long-ago battle, and he knew what had come of that Lord's men and their families, and the knowing sat in him with a particular weight that was neither guilt nor its absence, but something in between that had no clean name. Hannah, her name meaning flower, which was perhaps why someone had given it to her, some earlier tenderness in her life before the world had stripped away everything tender, sat under the bridge and watched this old soldier with the gray in his hair and the hilt of a sword at his hip, and her face said nothing at all. He placed the rice balls on the stone beside her, still faintly warm in their cloth, and he said nothing because there was nothing ready to say, and he walked back up to the bridge and continued on his way, which in those days had no particular direction. The second morning he came back and did the same thing, and the third morning was the same, and on the third afternoon he found himself thinking about it at the edge of sleep, the way you think about unfinished things, not with urgency, but with a quiet, recurring weight, like a door left open in the wind. On the fourth morning, he came down under the bridge the same as always, and he set the cloth bundle down on the stone, and when he turned to go, he felt a hand close around the sleeve of his coat. Just a small, cold hand, gripping the rough fabric, not pulling him back, not demanding anything, just holding on, the way someone holds on when they have made a decision and are too tired to explain it and too sure to let go. He stood still and waited, and what arrived after a moment was not a plan, but a plain and simple clarity. The word stay, without conditions or arrangements attached to it. He told her his name, and he told her, in the quietest voice he had used since the night his Lordice had died, asking him a question he could not answer, that he had a house with a roof that needed work and a garden that had gone entirely to seed, and that he was not easy to live with, particularly in the mornings, and that she would need to decide for herself. She told him her name was Hannah, and that she had slept in colder places than a broken house, and that she did not mind difficult people as long as they were honest about being difficult. Something loosened in him, then. A sound came out, short and startled, more like a release than a laugh, though it was both the first such sound he had made in what felt like years, and they walked back to his house through the fresh snow together, the old soldier and the thin child, without further discussion. In the weeks that followed, Takashi came to a quiet arrangement with his sword. Not a permanent one. Not yet. The sword was still cleaned in the evenings, still set in its stand with the same slow ceremony, the way habits persist whose purposes have shifted without quite ending. But the sword stayed in the stand, and from the corner of the main room where it rested it watched him go about other business, carrying water, patching the roof with new cedar shingles, sweeping out the rooms that had gathered dust in the years he had lived alone, and treated the house as little more than a place to wait. When the snow melted enough to work the back garden, he took the hoe out of the storage shed, a heavy iron hoe, rust-pitted and unfamiliar in his grip, and he went to work on the earth, which was as hard and uncooperative as any difficult thing he had ever tried to move. His palms split the first week, the way they had split when he was 15 years old and a foot soldier with new calluses forming over older blisters, and he looked at the familiar blood on his hands with a strange equanimity. The same hands, the same yielding of skin, but the object in them was different, and the ground was receiving what they offered differently. Hannah helped without being asked, carrying water from a well in a clay jar with both hands, setting it down beside him in the rows without interrupting, with the etiquette of someone who understood that certain kinds of work are done best in silence. He was learning, a child of considerable precision. She did what she did with great attention and without much fuss, and she watched what he did with the same careful eye she had turned on him under the bridge, as if she were still deciding something, and he found that he did not mind being watched this way. They ate together in the evenings, the two of them at the low table, and conversation came gradually and unevenly, the way plants come up, nothing for a while, and then something small, and then more, and the patterns of it becoming familiar without ever being entirely predictable. He learned that she woke up slow and needed tea before she was ready to speak, and she learned that he sometimes sat for long minutes in the morning staring at the garden with an expression she could not read and had decided was not unhappiness, just age and memory doing what they do. The first year in the garden was modest. A few things grew, not enough to be satisfying, just enough to confirm that the soil could be persuaded, and Takashi reminded himself, not without effort, that his father had tended a difficult piece of ground all his life and had understood this kind of patience not as virtue, but as the simple nature of the work. In the second year, the garden returned something closer to abundance. Green rows and root vegetables, and enough for the evening meals. And Hannah had learned to preserve things in salt, which she did with the same quiet seriousness she brought to everything, and the house felt for the first time in as long as he could remember, like a place where things were being kept. It was midway through that second year that Hannah came home one afternoon carrying a small plum tree in her arms like a fragile and important cargo. She had gotten it from a woman in the village who had too many cuttings she mentioned, and she wanted to plant it at the far end of the garden, near the old wall, where the morning light came through a gap in the stones. She planted it without asking for help, kneeling in the earth and pressing the roots down with both palms, and Takashi watched from the veranda without saying anything because there was nothing to say. She had decided in the way she decided things, and the decision was already made, and the tree was already in the ground. When she came inside, she washed her hands and sat down and told him that the tree would take 2 or 3 years to bloom, and that this was fine, and that she intended to wait. He said that was a reasonable plan. She said she thought so too, and that was the end of it for a long while. In the third winter after Hannah had come to live in his house, on a morning in the cold, deep heart of the season, when the frost lay across everything and the air tasted of iron and the light came up late and pale, Takashi went out before dawn to check the water barrel and stopped on the top step of the veranda. There was a blossom on the plum tree. One single blossom, small and pale and perfectly open, balanced on a bare branch above the frost-hardened ground, in the exact place where the morning light came through the gap in the wall. And the light was just beginning, the sky behind the wall starting to lift from black into the deep gray blue of early morning. And the blossom was the only pale thing in a dark and sleeping garden. He stood on the steps in his bare feet, without a coat, and he looked at it for a long time. He thought of Run, who had said he would have 7 children and a rice field, and that Takashi could live on the plot beside him, and who had been carried out of the mud heavier than he had been alive, and whose laughter Takashi had been carrying in his chest since before he was fully grown, not knowing what to do with it, not quite able to set it down. He thought of his Lord Daichi, who had died with a question in his mouth, "What is the sword for?" and who had smiled faintly before the end, as if the absence of an answer was, in the end, a satisfying kind of answer. He thought of his father Kenji's voice, that one morning in the snow, telling him that the first thing a blade-carrying man must cut is his own softness, and how he'd spent 40 years believing that what was meant was hardness, until eventually he had understood that the softness his father meant was a different kind, the kind that refuses the thing in front of you, the kind that will not go back to the same bridge on the fourth morning. He thought of Hannah carrying the small Plum tree home in her arms with her precise and asking nothing manner, and pressing the roots into the earth without ceremony, and then washing her hands and sitting down to tea. He thought of the water jar and the quiet evenings and the salt jars lined up in the storeroom and the sound of a child doing her reading in the next room while he sat with his wine and his old thoughts, and how all of that had arranged itself around him, season by season, while he was still trying to understand what he was doing. He thought of all of it standing on the cold step in his bare feet, and then he stopped thinking and he wept. Not the quiet kind, not the kind a soldier learns when the crying is something to be managed and not shown. He wept the other kind, the kind that comes out of you without permission, loud and without apology, going up into the cold morning air and dissolving into it. He wept for Run, who had wanted 7 children and a field and got none of what he had imagined, and for his Lord, who had died politely without resolution, and for his father, who had been kind in a language Takashi had spent most of his life misreading, and for all the cold mornings and miles of road and the weight of every wrong decision made under the impression that hardness and strength were the same thing. He wept a little for the fact that it had taken him this long, and then, after a moment, he let even that go, because there's a kind of grief that knows when it is finished with grieving about itself. He was standing there, quieting, when Hannah appeared in the doorway in her quilted jacket with her hair uncombed, drawn out by the sound, and she stood for a moment looking at him, and then walked over and put her hand on his arm. Not asking, not explaining, just standing beside him in the cold with her hand resting on his arm, in a frost-bright garden with a single pale blossom above them catching the first of the morning light. It was he would come to feel in the years that followed, the moment the long question of his life finally landed somewhere it could rest. Not with words, not with a tidy conclusion, but with the plain weight of a hand on an arm and a tree blooming in the cold, and the simple, sufficient fact of the life that had arranged itself around him. The sword was for putting down, not because the world had become peaceful, not because the need had passed for everyone everywhere, but because it had passed for him here in this garden with this person standing beside him, and that was reason enough. The years after that moved differently, not quickly, not slowly, but with the ease of years that are not being waded through, that simply arrive and are received and move on. The garden grew, and the plum tree grew taller, and Hannah grew up the way that children grown in patient ground grow up, at their own pace with their own shape, which turns out to be something you could not have predicted and would not have changed. She learned to read and to argue and to do accounts in her head faster than he could do them on paper, and she laughed loudly when something was funny, which turned out to be more often than he had expected, and eventually she married a young man from the valley who was respectful and slightly afraid of her father by adoption. which Takashi considered a mark in the young man's favor. There were grandchildren, and the grandchildren ran through the garden with the aimlessness of the very young, their direction governed entirely by whatever caught their attention in the previous moment. And sometimes they ran into the plum tree and scattered the blossoms early, and nobody minded. Takashi taught the oldest grandchild to hold a hoe, how to stand, where to put the weight, how the earth gives differently in different places and has to be read as much as worked. He considered once, briefly, teaching the child to hold a sword instead, but the thought was almost abstract by then, like considering a language he had once spoken fluently and now barely remembered, and it passed without effort. The sword remained in its stand in the corner, cleaned out of an old habit that had become simply a habit, and without ceremony, without a particular day he could name, he had stopped thinking of it as the central object of his life and begun thinking of it as one of the things in the house, which it was. Now, in the small room at the back, with the oil lamp burning low and the paper screen between him and the sleeping garden, the old man dipped his brush and at last began. He wrote slowly because his hand shook and because the words he wanted were not grand words. There was nothing grand he intended to say, no hard-earned wisdom to distribute, no instruction to hand down across the centuries. He wrote that he had carried a sword for most of his life, that he had used it as swords were meant to be used, and that for a long time he had not understood what else a life built on the sword could become. He wrote that his father had taught him that the first duty of man with a blade is to cut his own weakness, and that he had spent 40 years believing this meant hardness, and that he had been wrong, and that this kind of wrongness is the ordinary kind and carries no particular shame, and that the correction had arrived in the form of a small girl on a bridge who had held his sleeve. He wrote about the plum tree, about Hannah planting it in the gap of the morning light, about 3 winters of bare branches, about the morning when the first blossom opened above the frost, and he stood in his bare feet and wept without dignity and without regret. He wrote that Hannah had stood beside him and not said anything, which was the right thing to do, which she usually knew. He wrote that her name meant flower in the language of their country, and that this had taken him some years to feel as true rather than sentimental, and that he had arrived, eventually, at the feeling that it was simply correct. He wrote that he did not know where his sword would be by the time these pages were read, still in the stand in the corner, most likely, though houses change hands and things are scattered in the ways that things are scattered, and what happened to it afterward was not his concern. He wrote that if the person reading these words found a plum tree somewhere in their life, in a garden, in a courtyard, in a pot by a doorway, it was possible that it had come by the long and unhurried routes that seeds take across generations, from the tree Hannah had planted in the gap of the morning light. And that if it had, then the tree was the farthest reach of the blade he had carried, transformed by time and soil and patient watering into something that bloomed in the cold, that asked nothing, that simply opened when the light was right. He wrote that this seemed to him a better ending for a sword than he had ever imagined when he was young and believed that swords ended in one way only. He wrote that he would not offer advice, because he would be 400 years dead by the time these words were read and the world they had landed in would be past his imagining, and advice from the very old dead is usually worse than useless. He wrote only this, that the trembling in his hands as he set down the last line was the same trembling that had been in his hands the first night he was truly afraid, and on the morning of the blossom, and on the day Hannah had taken hold of his sleeve in the cold under the bridge, and that it had never left him, not in all the years since, and that he was glad of it. He wrote, "Wherever my plum tree grows is the farthest reach of the blade, and the most forgiving." He set the brush down and looked at the paper for a while, and found that it said what he had meant. He folded the pages with the same careful attention he had once given to the folding of maps before a march, and wrapped them in cloth, and placed them in the cedar box that was old enough now that the cedar smell had deepened into something harder to name. Not cedar anymore, exactly, but the memory of cedar, which is a different and perhaps better thing. He closed the lid. Outside, in the dark garden, the plum tree stood in the cold with its branches holding a few late blossoms still, patient and unhurried, the way things hold on when they have decided that winter is only a season and not a verdict. The lamp was running low. The lights softened and the shadows in the room deepened, and the line between the room and the garden beyond the paper screen dissolved into a single quiet dark, and the old man sat in it without hurry, listening to the particular silence of a house in which everyone else has long since gone to sleep. 400 years from now, or what would be 400 years from then, someone would open the cedar box and unwrap the oilcloth parcel and find the pages inside and read the first line, which said, "Whoever you are, you carry my blood, and I have been dead for longer than you can easily imagine." And perhaps in the garden outside the window of wherever that reader lived, there would be a plum tree. Perhaps just a small one in a corner, not thought about much, blooming each winter in the cold with the patient indifference of things that have been doing what they do for a very long time. And perhaps it had nothing to do with Takashi's garden at all. Perhaps it was just a plum tree, planted by someone else for its own reasons, in the ordinary way that plum trees are planted. But then again, perhaps somewhere in the long and branching and unhurried route from that morning by the old wall, from Hannah's careful hands pressing the roots into the frozen ground, a cutting had made its way through hands and seasons and courtyards, in the way that living things make their way through time, without planning it, without anyone keeping track, just growing. That is where the story rests tonight. Not with the sword, not with the battles that have long since dissolved into the general past, not even with the question that could never quite be answered cleanly, but here, in a garden at the edge of winter, where a single blossom holds in the cold and the light comes through the gap in the old wall at just the right angle, the way it always has, the way it will. And the old man, and the low lamp, and the letter folded in the cedar box, and the tree standing patient in the dark, all of it softening now, settling into the long quiet of the night and into rest. And so we come to the end of tonight's stories. These quiet voices from Japan, carried across the years, across the ocean, and into the stillness of your room, have all been told now. They rest where stories rest when the telling is done.